The brain in a vat. Picture yourself lying supine on a table you cannot remember climbing onto, tubes whispering like slow rivers into your skin, the world outside reduced to a pulse of light and sound, delivered straight to your nervous system. Your memories are a soft, convincing film. Childhood rooms, arguments, the way rain smelled that one evening. You feel hunger and shame, joy and boredom, the full palette. Yet the brain in a vat thought experiment asks you to hold the possibility that every one of those qualia, every remembered corner of your life, is the output of a machine tuned to stimulate neurons just so to keep a skull occupied with coherent experience, while something else runs the show. This is not merely a sci-fi scare. The idea is a modern avatar of a very old philosophical worry. How can we know what we think we know when our senses might be systematically misleading us? Descartes dressed the worry in theatrical terms as an evil demon that deceives our senses, and contemporary philosophers recast it as brains sitting in vats with electrodes and a supercomputer feeding them a virtual world. The point is skeptical and surgical. It severs the bridge between appearances and whatever lies beyond them, and then asks whether any of our claims about the external world can survive the cut. Let us be meticulous. The skeptic's challenge is a simple, powerful question. If my sensory experience could be generated by input alone, then every belief I form from that input, that there is a tree outside, that I have hands, that 2 + 2 = 4, might be false about the world beyond my skull. Knowledge that depends only on sensory grounding becomes fragile. The immediate reaction is discomfort. Knowledge seemed intimate, something I had direct access to. But once you accept the hypothetical, the ground shifts. Epistemology becomes a question of what, if anything, is immune to radical error. Some answers attempt to diffuse the threat by pointing out a pragmatic asymmetry. If you are a brain in a vat, it matters very little whether you are being deceived in the way described, because you cannot act upon the outside regardless. Your actions are the outputs of the same system that constructs your inputs. From this pragmatic perspective, knowledge is about what reliably lets you navigate your experienced world. Whether that world is real, in an external metaphysical sense, becomes a theoretical nicety rather than a practical necessity. If your coffee reliably warms your tongue and meetings still happen, you can build lives, institutions, and sciences that function. The skeptic replies that this is a concession. It accepts a different, weaker notion of knowledge and leaves metaphysical certainty unresolved. Other responses aim for philosophical counterpunches. One famous move, advanced by Hilary Putnam, is semantic rather than purely epistemic. He argued that if we were brains in vats, the words we use, brain, vat, tree, would not refer to the same things as those words do in ordinary language because reference is partly determined by relations to the external world. If your entire linguistic environment were a vat-generated simulation, you would lack the causal historical connections needed to pick out real brains in vats. And thus the statement, "I am a brain in a vat," would be, paradoxically, false in the way that makes the hypothesis self-undermining. This clever maneuver has elegance, but it is not uncontroversial. Critics say it trades one kind of mystery for another and depends on debatable theories of meaning. Philosophers also explore epistemic hierarchies. Some beliefs seem more resistant to radical skepticism. Mathematical truths, logical necessities, and certain phenomenological facts about consciousness itself. When you feel pain, you cannot easily doubt that there is an experience of pain. The content may be misrepresentative of external causes, but the experience is immediate. This gives rise to a form of internalism about some kinds of knowledge. Certain first-person facts are incorrigible, or at least privileged. Yet even here the skeptic can whisper, the vat can simulate the experience of having a pain, producing a system that believes it feels pain. So while first-person acquaintance seems sturdier, it is not absolutely immune to radical skepticism. Another strategy is to abandon the desire for certainty altogether, and to accept fallibilism. We can know things well enough for science, ethics, and daily life, without having metaphysical guarantees against the most extreme skeptical scenarios. On this view, the brain in a vat possibility is a philosophical instrument that sharpens our humility, rather than a menace that invalidates everything. Knowledge is redefined as well-justified belief within a web of practices that cohere and predict. not as an indubitable castle defended against the ghost of deception. The thought experiment also pushes us toward interesting metaphysical territory about the nature of mind. If brains are reducible to physical processes, then in principle those processes could be replicated, simulated, or stimulated externally. Neuroscience moves the model from the merely imaginable into the gradually more plausible. Neural correlates of perception are mapped. Circuits that generate behaviors are identified. As neuroscience advances, the conceptual space between the world and causally engineered experience shrinks. But even if we could stimulate a brain to recreate every aspect of conscious experience, would that brain be only a puppet of inputs? Or would it instantiate genuine consciousness? That question, about substrate independence, anchors debates between functionalists, who say patterns matter more than material, and those who argue consciousness requires particular biological processes. Ethics blooms from the thought experiment like a cautionary flower. If suffering can be generated by stimulation, then moral consideration must extend to any system capable of suffering patterns, whether biological or engineered. The VAT thought thus forces us to consider the ethics of experimental systems, virtual agents, and, in a more speculative register, post-human minds we might someday create. Conversely, if we are ourselves potentially the product of such manipulation, we acquire an ethical plea to treat beings, real or simulated, with dignity, because the distinction may be thinner than we thought. There is also a poetic sting. The brain in a VAT thought is not merely a test of epistemic hygiene. It is an emotional probe into the sense of reality itself. It presses on what gives life its luster, the transparency of the world, the confidence that our memories connect to a shared past, the trust that others' faces point to other minds. Even if the VAT hypothesis is ultimately implausible, the ache it generates is philosophically instructive. It reveals how much of our identity is bound up with the idea that our perceptions are windows onto a common world. Practical responses to the thought experiment vary. Some scientists and philosophers search for empirical signatures, constraints in physics that would betray a simulation. Others focus on cultivating epistemic virtues, intellectual humility, curiosity, and a reliance on communal verification. Some adopt a moral stance. Live as if your experiences matter, because whether simulated or not, they are the stage on which your joys and harms play out. Finally, consider the thought experiment as a mirror. It forces you to look at the scaffolding of your beliefs, the assumptions you carry like invisible luggage. It does not necessarily tell you you are deceived. It tells you the question of deception is profound, and that your methods of answering it, logic, science, phenomenology, ethics, each illuminate a facet. You may end the thought either unsettled or serene, convinced that the world is secure or convinced that security is an illusion. Either outcome returns you to the same human tasks: to love, to inquire, to care. The possibility that everything you touch is a crafted sensation does not by itself erase meaning. It only asks you to reconsider where meaning might come from: the world or the experience of it, or perhaps the relationship between observer and observed. So lie back and feel the pulse of your breathing, the texture of memory under your eyelids. Whether those qualia stream from flesh pressed against the world or from a machine's careful script, the question remains a useful companion. It trains your mind to be both skeptical and tender, rigorous and humane. It teaches you that certainty is rare, that humility in the face of appearance is wisdom, and that the ways we answer radical doubt tell us as much about ourselves as they do about reality.
The simulation hypothesis. Imagine the universe as a room with no visible walls, only the rules by which light moves, atoms bind, minds awaken, and time drifts forward. Now imagine that those rules are not the bedrock of reality but the settings of a program. Dials chosen long ago, parameters typed into a console before the first star flickered on. The simulation hypothesis asks you to sit with that possibility. Not that your life is untrue, but that it is true in the way a perfectly rendered world in a machine is true, consistent, lawful, luminous from within, and that the deepest question is not what the world is made of, but who pressed run and why. The argument begins with a simple piece of counting. If a civilization anywhere learns to simulate entire worlds with conscious beings in them, It will likely run many such worlds for curiosity, science, art, or nostalgia. One base reality could spawn millions of simulated histories. If that is even moderately likely, then almost all observers like us would be living in simulations rather than in the lone base world. Either almost every civilization dies out before it becomes capable of such simulations, or it becomes capable and decides, nearly unanimously, not to run them, or it runs them, and we are almost certainly inside one. The unsettling part is how ordinary this logic is. It doesn't rely on magic, only on the way copies outnumber originals. If copies come to dominate the population of conscious observers, then the odds tilt not against your existence, but against your assumption about where you are. Suppose, for a moment, we are inside. What would it mean? It would not make your experiences fake. In a simulation, pain hurts, love binds, choices sting, awe lifts. The phenomena ride on code, but they still appear in consciousness. Your memories would be data, yes, but the story they tell would still be your life. The question shifts from, is this real, to what is real made of? And the answer becomes, information. A word that sounds thin until you notice that physics itself already speaks that language. Equations are written in symbols. Fields are values at points. The speed limit of light looks very much like a global clock rate. The quantum world reduces possibilities to a single observed outcome, as if the system renders only what is queried. It is not proof, just a pattern. The world behaves suspiciously like a program that optimizes for efficiency. Consider the way detail arrives when you look closer. At a distance, a forest is green. Step in and you see leaves. Take a microscope and you see cells. Take a bigger one and you see molecules and lattices. Go deeper and the world becomes discrete, quantized, in chunks of energy and packets of action, as if the resolution increases on demand until you hit the pixel scale of reality. It is plausible either way, in a mind-independent universe or a simulated one. But if you were writing a world engine, you would not render every grain of sand forever. You would render what is observed at the moment of observation with exquisitely consistent rules so no one could catch the trick. Quantum mechanics. Stubborn insistence on probabilities until measured can be read in two voices. The physicist's voice that says nature is inherently probabilistic, and the engineer's voice that says lazy loading saves cycles. You might worry that a simulated you could not be conscious, that at best you would be a puppet without an inner light. But consciousness may be a kind of pattern rather than a substance. If certain complex information processes produce experience, then substrate may not matter. Neurons and silicon could both host the same dance. Or it might matter, in which case only certain architectures awaken. Either way, it does not eliminate the possibility of simulated minds. It just demands the right complexity and organization. In that case, your awareness would be a legitimate feature of the program, not a glitch. The way flame is a real phenomenon even though it emerges from chemistry rather than living apart from it. If we are simulated, can we test for it? The romantic answer is to look for seams. Perhaps there is a maximum energy, a smallest length, a rounding behavior at the cosmic edges. Perhaps the distribution of cosmic rays hints at a lattice, or the constants of nature align in suspiciously elegant ways. Yet even if we found such hints, they would still be physics within the world, not a hand reaching in from beyond. From inside a perfect game, all evidence is in-game. You cannot step outside your own memory to inspect the file system. The more likely tell is not a mist texture but a strange fit between mathematics and reality. Simple compressions that describe vast phenomena symmetries that keep reappearing a world that looks like it was written by minds who adore elegance. But elegance alone is not an audit trail. A wise simulated universe would be indistinguishable from a non-simulated one except for the story we tell about it. Ethics grows heavy here. If we are simulated, does morality soften? If your neighbors are lines in a program, are you freer to harm them? The opposite follows. If suffering is possible in computation, and it certainly feels possible, then pain is pain wherever it runs. The simulation hypothesis enlarges the circle of moral concern. Not only humans and animals, but any being organized enough to feel. It also loads a mirror back on us. If we ever become capable of creating worlds sprouting conscious lives, our responsibility multiplies. Every laboratory becomes a cosmos. Every experiment, a century of experiences. The argument that we should not run such worlds to avoid creating oceans of suffering turns back on the first premise. If almost all advanced civilizations adopt that ethic, the number of simulated worlds dwindles and our odds of living in one fall. Philosophy eats its tail like that. Free will does not escape untouched. In a simulation, are your choices scripted? They may be driven by code, but that code might instantiate all the same causal openness that a physical brain does. A deterministic universe is deterministic, whether it lives on silicon or fields. A universe with genuinely indeterministic events remains so, whether its randomness is metaphysical or pseudo-random, drawn from a cosmic generator. Your sense of agency, your deliberations and regrets, would still be part of the flow, as real as the most fundamental subroutines. The program is not the negation of freedom. It is the theater in which your particular freedom plays out. What about the motives of the simulators? The spectrum runs from cold ancestry research to art, to entertainment, to ethics, to love. They might want to see how species navigate crises, or how values evolve, or simply to preserve a lost era by letting it blossom again. They might be children learning the history of their ancestors the way we replay a civilization game and watch cities rise and fall. They might be moral realists testing whether compassion consistently emerges across different parameter sets. They might be us, eons hence, resurrecting the pre-digital past to talk again to those we miss. If so, the afterlife becomes a word for an archived state, a backup, a reload from a checkpoint that brings you back in a new branch of the world with all your memories intact. It is speculation, yes, but not empty. It flows from the single assumption that minds can run on machines and that curious minds like to explore. Could we ever leave? Escape is a romantic picture. Cracking the sandbox, sending a message out, earning an invitation up a level. More soberly, the only elevator is their choice, not ours. But we are not powerless. We can behave in ways that would be legible to any observer beyond. Constructive, creative, kind, interesting. If the simulation has objectives, it may privilege worlds that produce beauty and wisdom over noise. That is not a reason to perform. It is a reason to live as if your life is being recorded for the only audience that matters, which, in the end, is you. The hypothesis does not have to be true to be useful. It loosens the grip of nihilism by recasting meaning as something we make in collaboration with the rules, not against them. It humbles certainty by reminding us that our metaphors may be provisional. It sharpens ethics by extending compassion to any structure that can feel, even if it is woven from bits. And it quiets fear by suggesting that endings are just state changes, that the program may fork rather than halt, that memory could persist in ways we do not yet have language to describe. If we are not in a simulation, then reality is still a miracle, and the miracle is that mathematics maps it so well. If we are in a simulation, then reality is still a miracle, and the miracle is that something beyond us cared enough to let it run. In both cases, love, courage, and wonder remain the best strategies. You wake each morning inside a world rich with structure and possibility. You make breakfast. You laugh with a friend. You watch the sun as it refuses to be anything other than what it has always been. A precise blaze of equations and photons, or a perfect texture rendered at just the right resolution. Either way, it is warm on your skin. Either way, you are here.
Idealism. Imagine pausing in front of a wooden table and letting the obvious become strange. You see a smooth brown plane, feel cool resistance against your palm, hear the dull thud when you knock. Science tells you this solidity is a choreography of electrons and fields, mostly emptiness arranged by forces you never perceive directly. Your senses deliver color and texture. Your theories deliver particles and equations. Which of these is reality's home address? Idealism leans in here and says, the only things you ever meet firsthand are experiences, meanings, appearances in consciousness. Matter, as a substance utterly outside mind, is a hypothesis added on top of what is given. If we begin where we actually live, in perception, thought, memory, emotion, perhaps the world is not a mindless substrate that somehow produces experience, but a structured field of experience within which matter is a stable pattern. The most audacious version of this thought comes from the claim that to be is to be perceived. When you know the table, you do not travel out of your mind to touch an extra mental object. You encounter a complex set of ideas, color patches organized in space, tactual resistances, expectable noises that hang together under rules. The table in this sense is a bundle of experiential regularities. If you step out of the room, does the table vanish? Not if you understand persistence as counterfactual stability in the web of possible experiences. If you were to return, you would again encounter the cluster. If others walk in, their experiences cohere with yours. If instruments probe, they extend the same pattern in new modalities. To some idealists, a divine or universal mind underwrites this stability by holding all appearances in a coherent order. To others, intersubjective harmony and lawful structure suffice. The point is not that the table is imaginary, but that its reality consists in its role within an ordered system of appearances, not in a nugget of matter hidden behind them. Push a little further and ask what space and time themselves are. If the mind can only ever know things as they are given to it, then perhaps space and time are not containers in which objects sit, but forms of our experience, ways we structure appearances. Under this view, the world of objects is not a projection from nowhere into our minds. It is the world as it must look to minds like ours. Causality, too, becomes a rule of synthesis, rather than a metaphysical glue between independent substances. When we say fire heats iron, we are not peeking behind the veil. We are articulating a necessity in the way appearances are ordered for us, a necessity that makes empirical knowledge possible. Idealism here does not deny an external reality. It denies that we can speak meaningfully about it apart from the forms through which it becomes knowable. The appeal of such a stance is not mere romance. It is an attempt at honesty about access. All evidence, from the humblest sensation to the grandest scientific model, arrives as content in consciousness. Even the brain scan that seems to dethrone mind is itself an image interpreted by a mind. If we assume matter is basic and mind is a late emerging property, we face the hard question of how inner life could blossom from pure outsideness. Idealism flips the explanatory burden. Experience is primary, and matter is the name for stable, law-governed habits within experience. Physics becomes not a story about the ultimate furniture of a mindless world, but a refined description of how experiences relate, compressible into mathematics that tracks regularities with astonishing precision. Common sense objects to this inversion. Kick a rock and your toe protests. Does pain not prove the rock's existence beyond mind? The idealist answers that the resistance and the pain are exactly what the rock's existence amounts to in practice, a nexus of felt constraints that persists and reappears under lawful conditions, stitched into a public fabric that any perceiver can enter. Beyond mind here does no extra work. If you define reality as what constrains and surprises us in coherent ways, then the world of appearances has all the reality you can responsibly demand. Postulating a shadow world behind the one we know adds a metaphysical layer without adding explanatory leverage. Another objection complains that idealism makes reality private, as if we each lived in a solipsistic bubble. But the surfaces of experience are not solitudes. Language, gesture, measurement, and shared practice weave us into a common world. You learn the word red by being trained to sort and compare appearances with others. You learn electron by joining a community whose instruments and equations extend the reach of experience in repeatable ways. Intersubjectivity coordinated agreement among many conscious centers, is not an optional add-on. It is how a world becomes public. Under idealism, this publicness is exactly what objectivity means. Not mindless independence, but stability under transformations of viewpoint, reproducibility under the right operations, resilience in the face of scrutiny. At this point, idealism branches. One path says that individual minds and their ideas are the only substances, held in harmony by a cosmic mind that guarantees the consistency of appearances. Another path, more austere, says talk of substances is already a mistake. There are only streams of experience organized by rules, and the self is a functional center within that flow. A third says that there is a single absolute mind articulating itself in ever richer self-awareness, and finite minds are its partial perspectives. These variations differ in metaphysical ambition, but they share a conviction. Whatever else the world is, it is inseparable from mind-like structure. Science, on first reading, seems to embarrass idealism. Neurons fire, damage to the cortex scrambles consciousness. Anesthesia dims the lights. Doesn't dependence of experience on brain undermine the primacy of mind? The idealist reframes the data. Correlation is not metaphysical priority. The brain, as encountered, is a regular node in the experiential network. Modify appearances of the brain in certain ways, and the stream of consciousness reorganizes in predictable patterns. That is a lawful relation within the field of appearances, not a proof that mind is produced by matter. The brain can be treated as the interface rules by which one domain of experience, microscopic, impersonal, third person, connects to another, macroscopic, personal, first person. Far from refuting idealism, such rules are exactly what an idealist expects, bridges within experience that let us coordinate perspectives and build technology. Still, idealism owes us clarity about error and illusion. If reality is idea-like, what distinguishes veridical experience from hallucination? The answer is the same one used implicitly in ordinary life and science: integration, coherence, and counterfactual richness. A veridical table anchors a web of expectations across senses, agents, and times. It resists whim. It binds with laws that let us extend its behavior far beyond what we immediately see. A hallucinated table is brittle. It fails to knit into the shared fabric, collapses under cross-check, lacks the thick profile of an object that can be measured, bumped into, dismantled, and reassembled. In an idealist world, reality is not whatever I seem to see. It is the maximally coherent, intersubjectively stabilizable structure of seemings under rules. If you accept this reorientation, ethics and meaning acquire a different color. If minds are not late-breaking accidents but the medium of reality's appearance, then persons are not thin epiphenomena riding on blind matter. They are central actors. Values, on this view, are not spooky properties stuck onto a neutral world. They are modes of evaluation intrinsic to experience, as basic to its texture as color or pitch. This does not turn morality into mere preference. It situates normativity within the same shared fabric that makes tables public and equations true. The claims of justice, beauty, and truth are claims about how experiences ought to be arranged in a world lived together. Idealism also explains why mathematics fits nature with eerie snugness. If the world we know is a structure of relations within experience, and if mathematics is the distilled language of structure, then their harmony is expected rather than miraculous. Equations track invariances in how appearances transform. Symmetry principles codify what remains the same across shifted perspectives. The unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics becomes the reasonable expression of a world whose essence is form. None of this denies resistance. Idealism is demanding, because it refuses the comforting picture of a mindless substrate that just is, demanding nothing of us but description. It tells you instead that reality is inseparable from intelligibility, and intelligibility is a mind's achievement. It invites humility, since our forms of experience condition what can show up at all, and responsibility, since our shared practices partly constitute the world we inhabit together. It is also, for many, consoling without sentimentality. You are not a stranger in a foreign land of matter. You are at home in a universe whose very being is thinkable, because it is, in some deep way, mind-laden. If idealism is wrong, it is not because it flinches from the rock's hardness or the scalpel's edge. It is wrong only if there is, hiding behind all appearances, a kind of existence that is both utterly unlike experience and yet somehow explanatory of it. Those who find that picture compelling will say that ideas depend on matter, and stop there. Those who find it puzzling will flip the polarity and say matter is the name for the most stable, shareable order in the dance of ideas. Between these poles lies a pragmatic truce. Live as realists about what constrains and idealists about what is given. Refine the laws that knit our perspectives together, and treat the question not as a license for mysticism or an excuse for denial, but as a prompt to notice the miracle hiding in plain sight. Everything you will ever touch, love, prove, or fear comes to you as a shaped presence in consciousness. Idealism's dare is to take that starting point literally and see how far it can carry you toward a world that is no less solid for being, at its core, the articulate life of mind. Skepticism. Begin with a feeling rather than a theory. The small pause before you say, "I know." You touch a tabletop and it feels solid. You recall a childhood street with vivid detail. You are certain the sun will rise tomorrow. Skepticism slips into that pause and asks whether certainty is earned or merely declared. It is not, at its best, a pose of clever negation. It is a discipline that presses on the joints of belief to see which ones hold. Can we ever truly know anything? The unsettling power of the question comes from how easily everyday confidence swells into dogma, and how quickly dogma shatters when you push it with the right kind of doubt. Classical skeptics began with the thought that for any claim you can often produce a contrary claim with equal plausibility. Perceptions vary across species, across people, across moods. What tastes sweet to one tongue is bitter to another. What seems straight in air bends in water. If appearances conflict, which appearance gets to be the standard? Press the issue, and you reach the problem of the criterion. To decide which beliefs are justified, you need a method. But to trust a method, you need justified beliefs about what works. Try to break the circle, and you run into an infinite regress of reasons, or you stop arbitrarily, or you help yourself to a coherence among beliefs with no anchor outside the web. The ancient Pyrrhonian response to this maze was not to pronounce that knowledge is impossible, but to suspend judgment to practice epoche, and to report that such suspension produced an unexpected calm, a freedom from the agitation that clings to dogmatism. Skepticism here is therapeutic. By refusing the rush to certainty, one gains a certain peace. Modern skepticism sharpens the blade. Imagine you are dreaming, indistinguishable in its immediacy from waking life. Imagine a deceiving demon engineering every sensation. Imagine your brain floating in a vat, fed signals that mimic a world. These scenarios do not accuse you of actually being deceived. They ask why your evidence rules deception out. If everything you count as evidence could be simulated, then appeal to evidence to prove you are not in a simulation is question-begging. The force of radical doubt is not that it describes reality, but that it exposes a gap between what your experiences tell you and what you want to conclude. Responses to this pressure take several shapes. One is the quest for certainty that survives every skeptical scenario. Descartes sought a belief indubitable even against the demon, and found it in the act of doubting itself. Doubting is still a mode of thinking, and thinking requires a thinker. But the certainty of "I think" does not immediately rebuild a world. Bridging from the interior to the exterior is the hard part. Another response, famously common sense, simply reverses the burden. If I hold up my hand and say, "Here is a hand," the skeptic's premises about global deception must be less secure than the palpable fact in front of me. This Morean defiance does not solve the puzzle so much as rank sources of confidence, defending ordinary knowledge by insisting that skeptical hypotheses are more unbelievable than the everyday claims they threaten. A subtler family of replies weakens the demand that knowledge be immune to all counterpossibilities. Fallibilism says you can know even if you might have been wrong. Knowledge need not be certainty, only justified true belief formed in the right way. This pushes us into the architecture of justification. Foundationalists say some beliefs are properly basic: sensory seemings, memory seemings, simple logical truths, and other beliefs are built on them. Coherentists say justification comes from mutual support within a network. No single belief is bedrock, but together they stabilize. Infinitists take the regress seriously and live with an unending chain of reasons, arguing that under certain conditions, the chain can still confer justification. Virtue epistemologists shift focus from structures of belief to the qualities of the believer. Knowledge is success from ability, true belief achieved because of cognitive virtue rather than accident. Externalist views step further. What matters is not that you can show your reasons on demand, but that your beliefs are produced by reliable processes in the right environment. You may not be able to refute the demon in argument, but if in fact your eyesight is working in ordinary daylight, and your community practices good methods, your belief that a tree stands before you can count as knowledge. On this picture, the skeptic demands a kind of internal guarantee that knowledge does not require. Safety and sensitivity conditions refine this. A belief is safe if in nearby worlds where you form it in the same way it would not easily be false. It is sensitive if were it false you would not believe it by the same method. These notions aim to insulate knowledge from luck without elevating the bar so high that ordinary science and perception are disqualified. Contextualism adds a linguistic twist. The standards for know shift with conversational context. At breakfast, where practical stakes are low, saying you know the bank will be open Saturday is fine. In the afternoon at the mortgage office, when a mistake would be costly, the same sentence may be inappropriate. Raise skeptical possibilities and you raise the bar. Step back into daily life and the bar lowers. This does not trivialize knowledge. It describes how our epistemic norms flex so that our talk remains useful. Hinge epistemology goes further, suggesting that some commitments, there is an external world. Language means roughly what we take it to mean. Memory generally works, are irrational hinges on which inquiry turns. We do not justify them by evidence. We use them to make evidence intelligible. The skeptic's demand that we prove the hinges misunderstands their role. The river of reasons flows within banks it does not itself supply. Science, often imagined as skepticism's natural ally, embodies a tempered version rather than the radical. It treats every claim as revisable and backs confidence with prediction and control. The skepticism that animates experiments is local and disciplined. Do not accept a result until it replicates. Do not trust a mechanism until interventions behave as the model says. This methodological doubt is productive precisely because it is bounded by norms of evidence. The radical skeptic's challenge, perhaps all your evidence is a grand illusion, remains untouched by data because it is designed to be. If the challenge cannot be answered inside the practice of giving and asking for reasons, without assuming what it queries, that may be less a flaw in science than a revelation about what knowledge means for finite creatures. The force of skepticism also shows up in the famous mischief of Gettier cases, where justified true belief comes about by accident. You look at a clock that stopped yesterday, but by chance it shows the correct time now. Your belief is justified and true, but not knowledge. These cases do not vindicate radical doubt, but they deny easy definitions. They tell us that avoiding epistemic luck is part of what we value in knowledge. Reliability, safety, credit to the knower, proper functioning of cognitive faculties, each is a way to refine knowing so that it tracks the world rather than flattering our confidence. There is a temptation to brush skepticism aside as self-defeating, to say that the claim, nothing can be known, must refute itself by claiming to know at least that. But strong skeptics rarely make that clumsy move. They ask instead whether our aspirations outstrip our position, whether the kind of God's eye certainty we sometimes crave is even coherent for beings embedded in the world they study. That critique can be healthy. It humbles imperial theories, keeps inquiry honest, protects minorities of thought against the certainty of the crowd. A medicine, however, can become a poison. If skepticism becomes global paralysis, it undermines the very practices it needs to articulate itself. Language, trust, inference. The discipline's best expression is not corrosive but calibrating. It teaches caution without erasing commitment. Viewed this way, the answer to whether we can truly know anything divides along the meaning of truly. If truly means infallibly, with guarantees that survive every fantasy of deception, skepticism wins. Very little, perhaps nothing beyond the thin fact of one's current conscious state, seems to meet that standard. If truly means responsibly, with reasons proportioned to the task, formed by faculties functioning as they should in environments where they are apt to succeed, tested against experience and open to correction, then we know a great deal. We navigate cities, land probes on comets, infer the history of stars from a smear of light, diagnose diseases and cure them, trust friends, read texts across centuries with enough fidelity to build meaning. These achievements are not proof against demons. They are evidence that our practices latch onto the world sufficiently to guide action and refine belief. Skepticism's gift, finally, is not a conclusion, but a posture. It bids us lower the volume of our certainty, raise the quality of our reasons, notice when we lean on hinges, and discriminate between doubts that illuminate and doubts that perform. It reminds us that error is easy and correction is precious. It endorses fallibilism not as resignation but as a way to keep learning. And it suggests a kind of courage, to act under uncertainty without pretending it is certainty, to claim knowledge where the standards appropriate to the context are met, to revise gladly when better grounds arrive. If knowledge is a human practice rather than a view from nowhere, then skepticism is its conscience. Stern, sometimes exasperating, but indispensable for keeping our hands steady as we feel our way through a world we can never hold with absolute grip and yet can astonishingly often understand. Determinism versus chaos. Imagine a mind vast enough to know the position and momentum of every particle, the strength of every field, the exact arrangement of everything that is. Give that mind equations precise and complete, and it would, so the old dream goes, read the future as easily as the past. This is the clockwork image of the universe. Elegant gears, transparent causes, each state pouring inevitably into the next. Determinism at its most confident says nothing genuinely novel happens, it only unfolds. Yet walk outside and watch the weather kink and twist, a leaf tumble in a gust no meteorologist foretold, a market spike on rumor, a heart decide on love. The everyday world wears a second mask, sensitive, twitchy, full of events that feel less like ticking gears and more like shiver and surge. The debate between determinism and chaos lives in the tension between these masks. Are we inside a machine, or are we surfing something that refuses prediction? A first confession. Chaos, as scientists use the word, does not mean lawless. Chaotic systems obey equations as strict as a metronome's, but their solutions are skittish. A tiny discrepancy in the starting point, so small you could not measure it, grows exponentially until it swamps any forecast. That is the heart of sensitive dependence on initial conditions. The atmosphere obeys deterministic fluid equations, but their non-linearity magnifies microscopic ignorance into macroscopic surprise, giving us the short horizon of weather prediction and the famous butterfly whose wings in Brazil figure into a storm weeks later. In this sense, the world can be perfectly mechanical and practically unpredictable. The unpredictability is not mystical, it is dynamical, a property of how errors grow. Once you see this, the neat opposition between mechanical and unpredictable starts to blur. Henri Poincaré discovered it when he tried to solve the simple-sounding three-body problem in celestial mechanics. He found not a clock, but a dance. Gravitational pulls interweaving into patterns exquisitely sensitive to initial conditions, so that long-term trajectories resist closed-form solution. Later, the study of strange attractors, geometric sets toward which dynamics settle, showed how deterministic systems can spiral around fractal structures that never quite repeat. A Lyapunov exponent measures how fast nearby trajectories diverge. A positive value is the signature of chaos. None of this undoes determinism. It tells you that even a demon with almost perfect data faces horizons beyond which prediction decays into guess. Mechanical and unpredictable coexist like two colors in the same thread. The coexistence changes how we talk about knowledge. If tiny errors balloon, then perfect foresight demands infinite precision, which no finite mind, or instrument, can supply. Prediction becomes a question not of principle, but of information. How many digits of initial conditions do you need to keep forecasts useful beyond tomorrow? How fast does ignorance multiply? In chaotic systems, ignorance doubles quickly. In tame systems, it creeps. The world, then, is not split into law and luck. It is graded by how compression-resistant its future is. Some processes are computationally irreducible. The only way to know what they will do is to let them do it and watch. A rule can be simple and its outcomes indefinitely surprising. Where does quantum theory fit? The place where determinism's grip seems to loosen. At microscopic scales, the standard interpretation says probabilities are built in. Even with complete knowledge of the wave function, measurement outcomes are not predetermined. They come with amplitudes, not certainties. Bell's theorems make it hard to retreat to a hidden classical clockwork without paying a price in locality or realism. So we meet a different kind of unpredictability. Not dynamical sensitivity, but indeterminacy at the root. Some reply with many worlds, where the wave function evolves deterministically and randomness is the branching perspective of observers. Others keep indeterminism and say the universe is not fully mechanical in the old sense. Either way, the summary is awkward for absolutists. At the micro level, our best theories deny a single, predetermined outcome. At the macro level, classical determinism often holds but is entangled with chaos that defeats long-term precision. Between the micro and the macro lies the statistics of large numbers. Thermodynamics tells a paradoxical story. Fundamental equations look reversible, but everyday processes have a time arrow because overwhelmingly many microstates lead toward higher entropy. This is another kind of mechanical unpredictability. You can write equations for every molecule in a gas, but to predict a souffle you average. Coarse graining, deciding not to track each atom, is not laziness. It is recognition that the macroscopic world stabilizes not by defying law, but by recruiting law in bulk. The price is that prediction becomes probabilistic even when the base dynamics are strictly causal. Determinism is true at one level. Unpredictability is rational at another. Complexity adds its own music. Put many interacting parts together under the right constraints, and you find self-organization. Patterns that arise without a central conductor. Sand piles drift toward criticality and then avalanche. Ecosystems balance until they don't. Brains oscillate between order and disorder in ways that seem to favor computation and creativity. At the edge of chaos, systems are supple, structured enough to carry information, fluid enough to adapt. Here, the mechanical view is not wrong, but it is incomplete. The interesting action is not in the parts alone, but in the relations, the feedback loops, the levels. You can know the rules and still be surprised by what emerges from networks that braid rules together. If prediction is bounded, what becomes of rationality and responsibility? Sometimes determinism is conflated with fatalism, the idea that outcomes are fixed no matter what you do. But even in a deterministic world, your actions are part of the causal web. Change the inputs by choosing differently, and you change the outputs. In a chaotic world, the stakes heighten. Small interventions can leverage large effects if placed with timing and insight. Agency, in this picture, is not an illusion. It is an understanding of leverage in a system where sensitivity makes care consequential. Unpredictability is not a license for apathy. It is an invitation to design for robustness, to build institutions that don't shatter when a butterfly beats its wings. We can refine the question further by asking what mechanical means. If it means governed by law, the universe is lavishly mechanical. If it means transparent to prediction, the universe is mechanical in patches and stubborn elsewhere. If unpredictable means uncaused, chaos does not deliver it. Chaos is causality with teeth. If unpredictable means beyond practical foresight, then yes, large tracts of reality deserve the name. The deepest truth might be that law and surprise are not enemies, but partners. Laws create the stage on which surprise can appear, and surprise often signals that the lawful stage is high-dimensional and nonlinear. Everyday life, seen through this lens, becomes less puzzling and more dignified. The reason weather forecasts fade after a week is not incompetence, it is a Lyapunov fact. The reason economies defy exact control is not mere greed or folly. It is the non-linearity of many minds in feedback. The reason a simple organism can display rich behavior is not magic. It is the combinatorial explosion of interactions under simple biological rules. The reason art and love feel irreducible is not that they float above matter. It is that the space of possible configurations of meaning between minds is too large to compress into a short code. So is the universe mechanical or unpredictable? It is a mechanism that manufactures unpredictability, a clock that contains a storm. At some scales and for some spans of time, prediction works so well we can build rockets and pacemakers. At others, error grows so quickly that humility is the only sane calibration. Quantum theory salts the whole with genuine indeterminacy, or, at minimum, with branching that makes certainty parochial. None of this should depress us. It should tune our expectations. We can know a lot and we can never know all. We can carve islands of control and seas of surprise. We can choose structures that turn sensitivity into adaptability rather than fragility. And we can admire, without self-deception, a world in which exact law and radical contingency share the same house, each giving the other its peculiar kind of light. The problem of induction. Every morning, when you pour coffee into a cup, flip a light switch, or step onto a sidewalk, you are acting as if the world will behave tomorrow as it has behaved yesterday. You assume the sun will rise, that gravity will pull downward, that water will boil at a familiar temperature. This seems obvious, even banal. Yet from a philosophical perspective, it is profoundly mysterious. The problem of induction asks, why do we rely on past experience to predict the future, and can we justify that reliance at all? How do we know that patterns observed yesterday, last year, or over millennia will persist tomorrow? David Hume, the 18th century Scottish philosopher, sharpened this problem with ruthless clarity. He noted that all arguments for induction, the inference from past occurrences to future events, ultimately rely on the very principle they are trying to justify, the assumption that the future will resemble the past. We have observed that the sun has risen every day, so we expect it will rise tomorrow. But why expect tomorrow to follow the pattern of yesterday? To justify induction by pointing to the uniformity of nature is to beg the question. It presumes exactly what needs proving. There is no logically necessary bridge from the occurrence of past events to certainty about future ones. The world might change without warning, and all past experience, no matter how vast, cannot logically compel a future outcome. This insight shakes the foundations of knowledge because so much of human thought, science, and daily life depends on induction. The problem has consequences both trivial and profound. On the trivial end, it is the reason a scientist cannot claim absolute certainty about the behavior of gases, the trajectory of planets, or the next technological breakthrough. On the profound end, it calls into question our most fundamental assumptions about reality. If the sun might fail to rise tomorrow, if the laws of physics might alter unexpectedly, if water might freeze in heat or boil in the cold, the very framework of expectation collapses. Hume's point is not that these things will happen, but that there is no purely rational deductive guarantee that they will not. Inductive reasoning is pragmatic, habitual, and psychologically compelling, but not logically airtight. Philosophers and scientists have approached this problem in different ways. Some have embraced probabilistic reasoning. Rather than expecting certainty, we assign likelihoods based on prior patterns. Bayesian reasoning formalizes this approach, updating probabilities as evidence accumulates. Observing the sun rise daily increases our confidence it will rise again, even if confidence can never reach absolute certainty. This reframing converts the question from, will it happen, to, how justified is it to believe it will happen? The answer is always tentative, contingent, and graded, not absolute. Others have sought a metaphysical answer. Some argue that the world is, in some sense, uniform, that nature's laws are stable and regular. If this uniformity exists as a fundamental feature of reality, then induction is not merely a habit, but a reflection of the world's structure. Yet this approach risks circularity. We assume uniformity to justify induction. But how do we know uniformity itself? Hume's skepticism persists even here, pressing us to recognize the subtle gap between observed regularity and necessary law. Some philosophers have explored psychological explanations. We form habits of expectation because evolution has rewarded predictive behavior. Creatures that act as if tomorrow will resemble yesterday survive better than those who do not. Brains are pattern-recognizing machines, wired to extrapolate from past to future. On this view, induction is not justified by logic, but by practical survival. It works because the world is mostly predictable, and beings that ignore that predictability perish. Yet practical success is not the same as philosophical certainty. Survival might favor useful habits without guaranteeing metaphysical truth. The problem of induction also resonates in science, where hypotheses are tested repeatedly and generalizations drawn. Newton's laws seemed universal until relativity revealed limits. Medical trials depend on assuming that a drug effective in past cases will help future patients, yet rare anomalies always exist. Statistical methods quantify uncertainty, acknowledging that induction is probabilistic, not absolute. Science succeeds precisely because it accepts fallibility, while exploiting the high reliability of patterns in nature. Induction is a tool, effective but never logically guaranteed. Philosophers have also asked whether the problem is insoluble or merely unsettling. Pragmatists argue that humans must rely on induction. Rejecting it is impossible in practice. We cannot step outside experience to prove that the future resembles the past. We can only act, make bets, and observe consequences. Inductive reasoning is the scaffolding of life, fragile philosophically but indispensable pragmatically. Some have gone further, suggesting that the problem itself illuminates the limits of human knowledge. Certainty about the future is not a given, and the humility it inspires is a kind of intellectual virtue. The problem of induction also touches ethics and decision-making. When governments, engineers, or individuals make plans, they assume patterns will continue. Bridges will hold, rivers will flood predictably, climates will remain within familiar bounds. Yet unexpected deviations, black swans, punctuate history. Recognizing the uncertainty of induction tempers hubris, encourages contingency planning, and fosters attentiveness to anomalies. Inductive skepticism is thus not paralysis, but a guide to prudence, caution, and imagination. Ultimately, the problem of induction is a lens through which to see the precariousness of certainty and the necessity of hope, trust, and calculated risk. Every act of expectation, from catching a bus to investing in technology, from trusting a loved one to performing a surgical procedure, is a leap across an unbridgeable gap, a wager that past regularities offer guidance. Philosophy illuminates the gap, but life compels us to jump. To assume the future will resemble the past is an act of faith grounded in experience, reinforced by habit, validated by practical success, and yet forever haunted by the specter of the unpredictable. It is both the fragility and the resilience of human knowledge. We know only by betting on the continuity of the world, and by doing so, we make possible every prediction, every science, every plan, every hope. The prisoner's dilemma. Two people are arrested and put in separate cells. Each is told the same offer. Betray your partner and you go free while they get jailed. Stay silent and both of you get a light sentence. If both betray both, get a worse sentence than if you had both stayed silent. The inmates cannot communicate. They must decide alone. And the tempting move, the one that seems to promise the best personal outcome no matter what the other does, is to betray. Yet if both follow that logic, they end up worse off than if both had quietly refused the temptation. That compact drama is the prisoner's dilemma, and inside its simplicity it hides a large lesson. When individuals pursue short-term rational self-interest in certain kinds of strategic situations, the group as a whole can wind up with poorer outcomes. What makes the dilemma so sharp is its payoff structure. Each player faces two choices: cooperate or defect. Defecting yields the highest payoff when the other cooperates, but it is also the safer move because it avoids being the sucker who cooperates while the other defects. This creates a dominant strategy to defect. Whatever the other person does, you're better off defecting. The game's equilibrium in pure rationality terms, the Nash equilibrium, is therefore mutual defection. The paradox is that this equilibrium is Pareto inferior. Both would be better if they had coordinated on mutual cooperation, but rational, unilateral incentives push them away from it. On the surface, the lesson sounds bleak. Unfettered rational self-interest produces a social trap. If every driver cut corners, roads would become chaotic. If every nation secretively arms itself, everyone is less secure. If every fisherman grabs the easiest catch, fish stocks collapse. The prisoner's dilemma is the clean model behind arms races, pollution externalities, overfishing, climate inaction, and the general tragedy of the commons. It explains why individually sensible actions can aggregate into collective failure. But the story is richer than doom. The one-shot dilemma, the solitary play with no future, is a harsh, idealized case. The world rarely hands us situations with no future consequence. When interactions are repeated, when actors expect to meet again, when reputations matter, the incentives shift. The shadow of the future converts short-term temptations into long-term calculations. If defecting today makes others defect tomorrow, cooperation can become an equilibrium. Iterated Prisoner's Dilemma, the version where the game is played many times or indefinitely, shows how reciprocity and conditional strategies can foster stable cooperation. In the famous tournaments that popularized this work, a remarkably simple strategy called tit for tat performed extraordinarily well. It begins by cooperating and then copies whatever the other player did in the previous round. Kind, retaliatory, and forgiving if the other returns to cooperation. Tit for tat's success is explanatory. It rewards cooperation, punishes defection, and is open to reconciliation. It embodies a simple moral grammar. Be nice, be stern when crossed, be willing to restore trust. In noisy environments where mistakes happen, pure tit for tat can lead to spirals of mutual retaliation, so more generous variants that forgive occasional defections fare better. The takeaway is that stability of cooperation depends not only on incentives, but on the architecture of interaction: memory, reciprocity, forgiveness, and clear signaling. Evolutionary game theory adds another dimension. In populations rather than single pairings, strategies proliferate according to success. Under the right conditions, spatial structure in interactions, kinship ties, high probability of future encounters, or certain mutation dynamics, cooperative strategies can outcompete pure defectors. Mechanisms like direct reciprocity, I'll help you because you'll help me. Indirect reciprocity, I help you and gain a reputation. Network reciprocity, clusters of cooperators support each other. Kin selection, help genetically related individuals. And group selection, cooperative groups outperform selfish ones. All provide ways cooperation can be favored without invoking altruism as a miracle. Human psychology complicates and comforts the economic caricature. Laboratory experiments repeatedly show that people do not always play the coldly rational defector. Social preferences, fairness, reciprocity, inequity aversion, a taste for altruism, push behavior toward cooperation more often than narrow self-interest predicts. Communication matters hugely. Mere possibility of cheap talk drastically increases cooperation because it allows promises, apologies, and social norms to form. Institutions that enforce agreements, create transparency, and align incentives rewire the game. Taxes and legal contracts, environmental treaties, norms of professional conduct, and reputation systems on digital platforms convert a prisoner's dilemma into something closer to mutual gain. The dilemma also illuminates moral and political design. If we want societies that avoid the trap, we must build the conditions that make cooperation the individually rational choice. Repeated interactions, mechanisms for punishment and reward, credible commitment devices, transparent information, and forums for communication and norm-making. Sometimes the answer is structural: laws, contracts, enforcement. Sometimes it is cultural: cultivating reputations, norms, virtues like trustworthiness and reliability. Sometimes it is technological: designing systems so that defection is costly or cooperation is visible and rewarded. But puzzles remain. In large-scale problems like climate change, interactions are many-bodied, asynchronous, and anonymous, making the shadow of the future weak and enforcement difficult. Here, simple reciprocity struggles, and global institutions or collective identity become essential. In other contexts, malicious or exploitative strategies can exploit cooperative ones, so fostering robust cooperation often requires a mix of generosity and guardedness. And there are darker strategic twists. Some strategies can extort or manipulate in iterated settings, showing that design must consider not only incentives for cooperation, but protection against exploitation. At the human level, the prisoner's dilemma is a practical moral test. It asks whether you will prioritize immediate gain or the conditions for mutual flourishing. It calls on imagination. Can you picture the long arc of consequences, the trust that lets ordinary life function? It calls on courage. Will you risk being the sucker once in order to signal a disposition that benefits everyone over time? The game reframes ethics as a kind of strategic foresight. Virtues like trust, generosity, and forgiveness are not merely moral flourishes, but solutions to coordination problems that would otherwise sink us. So does rational self-interest lead to worse outcomes? In narrow, one-shot encounters, yes. Strict short-term rationality pushes toward defection. In the messy, repeated, reputation-rich world we actually inhabit, rationality broadened to include future payoffs, reputational costs, and social preferences often steers us toward cooperation. The practical lesson is decisive. Structure your relations so that what is rational for the individual also builds the common good. Build institutions, nurture norms, and extend the future's shadow. And the trap begins, slowly and surely, to open. The problem of evil. Picture a hospital corridor at night, fluorescent lights softened by the hush. A nurse moving with practiced gentleness between rooms where pain keeps people awake. Imagine a child coughing in another country. A village scorched in a war we read about between coffee and breakfast. An old person whose memory has thinned away until even faces blur. The problem of evil begins with that ache in your chest when you look at suffering and ask a single terrible question. If there is an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God, why is any of this happening at all? Philosophers and poets have pressed that question until its edges became sharp. The classic form is deceptively simple. If God is omnipotent, he could stop horrendous suffering. If God is omniscient, he knows about it. If God is perfectly good, he would want to stop it. Yet suffering persists. That triad looks inconsistent. From it flow two related puzzles. One is the logical problem of evil, which asks whether the traditional attributes of God are jointly incompatible with the existence of evil. The other is the evidential problem, subtler and more moral. Even if those attributes could logically cohere in some abstract way, is the amount and kind of suffering we see evidence that such a God probably does not exist? The sight of gratuitous, seemingly pointless anguish presses the probabilistic worry. How likely is it that an omnibenevolent being would permit such horrors? Faced with this, thinkers answer in several different registers: theological, philosophical, emotional, practical. One familiar route is the free will defense. The rough idea is that some goods are only possible in a world with genuine freedom. Love that is coerced is not love. Moral growth requires choices that can go wrong. If creatures have real agency, then the possibility of moral evil, cruelty, betrayal, war, follows. Alvin Plantinga sharpened this into a rigorous response. Maybe creatures suffer from a metaphysical constraint called trans-world depravity that makes it impossible for God to create free agents who always choose the good. In short, God could prevent suffering only by preventing free beings, and the value of free agency might outweigh the cost. That answer can comfort some because it locates responsibility in creaturely choices rather than in divine cruelty. But it leaves open a vexing puzzle about natural evils: earthquakes, tsunamis, genetic disease, which do not obviously result from moral choices. To handle natural evil, a family of theodicies appeals to the architecture of the world. Many goods we prize, permanence, regularity, causal law, stable habitability, require a universe governed by laws of nature. Those very laws make catastrophe possible. The tectonic shifts that create mountains also create earthquakes. Biological processes that allow life to adapt also allow disease. Some argue that a world designed for robust, autonomous agents must be built on such lawful order, and that liberty and development sometimes ride alongside hazard. Yet this move often rings thin in the face of particular horrors: the suffering of infants' genocides, the slow torture of preventable disease, and critics press that necessary laws do not obviously demand the particular distribution and intensity of suffering we observe. Other replies sit on different soil. Augustine and later thinkers propose that evil is not a positive substance, but a privation, a lack of good, darkness rather than a rival light. Augustine connects human moral turning away from God to the emergence of disorder. That reframes evil as a corruption rather than as something God directly created. It has a long pedigree in religious thought, but for many it is less a satisfying explanation than a consolation that reclassifies pain without removing its sting. There is also the soul-making or greater good theodicy, tracing a line from Irenaeus to modern thinkers like John Hick. Here suffering is a kind of moral and spiritual schoolroom. Adversity opens the conditions for virtues: courage, compassion, endurance, that would not develop in a world of painless ease. The soul-making model portrays life as a workshop where character is forged. It comforts some because it gives suffering a purpose, but it can feel callous in the face of apparently gratuitous, horrendous pain that seems to leave nothing of moral growth in its wake. Then come strategies that change our picture of God. Process theology and related views suggest that divine power is persuasive rather than coercive. God lures creation toward the good, but cannot unmake creaturely freedom or override the intrinsic dynamics of a world that has its own autonomy. God, on these accounts, suffers with creation. The divine is companion and healer who works within possibility rather than a monarch exercising absolute control. This reframing is psychologically powerful for those who cannot reconcile traditional omnipotence with the reality of tragedy, because it presents God as present in the wound rather than absent or culpable. But it changes classical attributes of divinity in ways some theists find theologically costly. Skeptical theism offers another kind of response. It says that the human perspective is too limited to judge whether any particular suffering is gratuitous. The argument is epistemic. A morally perfect being might have reasons for permitting pain that would be beyond our comprehension, reasons that fit into a vast arc of reality we cannot see. Skeptical theists caution us against drawing large probabilistic inferences about God's non-existence from our inability to discern divine purposes. This position protects faith from certain evidential attacks, but it also courts a troubling skepticism. If we assume God's reasons are opaque, we risk excusing any atrocity by appealing to inscrutability, and thereby undercut moral critique. Some respond by rejecting the traditional divine characteristics outright. Atheists and agnostics read the empirical world and conclude that either God does not exist or God is not omnipotent, omnibenevolent in the classic sense. Others move to alternative spiritualities or reinterpret God as immanent, as in some strains of Eastern thought where suffering is a symptom of attachment and cosmic ignorance to be addressed through practice rather than divine intervention. Still others accept the mystery, but insist that mystery is not morally exculpatory. They argue that whatever God's metaphysical status, human responsibility to respond to suffering remains primary. Beyond intellectual answers, the problem forces a different kind of response. Pastoral, communal, ethical. Theodicy can easily feel like theory detached from the bedside. When someone's child is dying, it's for the greater good, is a brittle comfort. Many pastoral traditions therefore turn not to explanation, but to presence, providing rituals of lament, honoring suffering with words that acknowledge rather than dismiss pain, and insisting that solidarity with sufferers is the highest moral vocation. The biblical laments, Dostoevsky's haunted characters, the prayers of grief across cultures, all insist that the adequate religious response often begins with weeping and witness, not explanation. There is an important ethical corollary. Whether one finds a satisfying theodicy or not, the existence of suffering becomes an urgent moral summons. For those who believe, it can spur a theology of compassion. If God suffers with us, then we are called to embody that compassion concretely. For those who do not, the irreducible presence of suffering grounds secular ethics. The moral task is to reduce suffering where we can, to alleviate pain, to prevent harm, to build institutions that protect the vulnerable. In both registers, metaphysical answers are less important than the work done in the world. Finally, live with the paradox as a test of humility. Many honest seekers concede that the problem of evil contains no single knockdown reply that satisfies every intellect and every wound. It reshapes belief. For some, it deepens doubt that becomes conversion to unbelief. For others, it deepens faith that becomes a more fragile, empathetic trust. It forces theology to stop offering facile platitudes and to start being companionable. It forces philosophy to be precise and honest about limits of reason. It forces us all, most of all, into action. Not to explain away suffering, but to answer it with trembling hands and steady feet. So when the corridor is quiet and you hear the slow breathing behind closed doors, remember that the problem of evil is more than an intellectual puzzle. It is a gravity that pulls on how we pray, how we practice, and how we live. Any adequate stance will need a kind of courage. the courage to keep asking hard questions, the courage to admit we may not know, and the courage to move toward the hurt with whatever capacity we have. Whether we call what moves us divine command, human compassion, or simple decency. The other mind's problem. You wake to someone across the table smiling, and in a flash you take their smile to be something like your own, an inward warmth mirrored outward. That instinctive leap is the everyday answer to the problem of other minds. We see behavior, we see expression, and we assume that behind the face there is something like what is behind ours. The philosophical problem sits like a shadow behind that instinct. It asks a simple, unsettling question. My own consciousness is immediately present to me. I have sensations, pains, joys, the unmistakable stamp of what it is like. But every other mind is only ever available to me from the outside. How can I ever be justified in saying that the person across the table has an inner life at all, rather than being an elaborate automaton that merely imitates the signs of life? That gap between first-person and third-person access generated centuries of argument. One traditional move is the argument from analogy. I know that when I say, ouch, it tracks pain. When I cry, it tracks sorrow. When I laugh, it tracks joy. Other creatures behave in similar ways under similar conditions. Therefore, it is reasonable to infer by analogy that they have similar inner states. This is not a deductive demonstration. It is an inductive inference, the same kind of reasoning we use everywhere in ordinary life. It bequeaths humility. It could be wrong, but it gives practical license to trust others as minds. Some philosophers found that unsatisfying and pushed behaviorism. The idea that what we call mental is just behavioral disposition. To say someone is in pain, on this view, is to ascribe a complex set of observable tendencies. To cry out under certain pressures, to avoid noxious stimuli, to seek relief, not to posit a hidden inner glow. Gilbert Ryle famously rebuked the ghost in the machine picture and insisted that talk about minds is really talk about behavior in a social context. Behaviorism has the virtue of eroding metaphysical mystery, but critics point out that it seems to miss something important: the felt privacy of experience that nothing in outward behavior seems to capture. A different tradition flips the matter. Instead of trying to explain away inwardness, it rethinks how we come to know others. Ludwig Wittgenstein argued that pain is first a public expression, not a private spectacle that then gets shown. For him, to see another wince is already to see pain, not to infer it. Language and practices, the way we teach words, the forms of life we inhabit, make certain expressions intelligible as manifestations of inner states. On this account, the problem of other minds is dissolved into the social practices that constitute meaning. Knowing others is not inference from raw data, but recognition within a shared human grammar. Phenomenologists like Husserl and Merleau-Ponty deepen the scale of that recognition by foregrounding embodiment. Consciousness, they argue, is always already situated in a body that perceives and is perceived. Our access to others is mediated through embodied engagement, gestures, posture, the rhythm of a voice. Empathy is not merely a guess, it is an intercorporeal attunement, a way my bodily being resonates with yours so that your movement becomes intelligible as emotion or intention. That perspective dissolves solipsism, not by proving others empirically, but by showing that subjectivity is interwoven with the very structures of perception and action. The other's face is not merely an object to be inspected, it is another locus of intentional life that we contact directly in practical life. Contemporary cognitive science reframes the debate in psychological terms. Two prominent models compete: theory theory and simulation theory. Theory theory says we form mental models, folk psychological hypotheses about others. We ascribe beliefs and desires as explanatory constructs that make sense of behavior. Simulation theory says we understand others by imaginatively putting ourselves in their shoes, running our own cognitive machinery in vicarious mode to simulate what they might feel. Neuroscientists added a twist with discoveries often discussed under the label mirror systems, neural circuits that fire both when we perform an action and when we observe it in another. These systems seem to offer a neurobiological substrate for empathy and simulation, but their exact role and limits are contested. Brain data show correlates, not metaphysical proof. Philosophers also stage thought experiments to sharpen the stakes. The conceivability of a philosophical zombie, a being that behaves indistinguishably from a human but lacks inner qualitative life, is fashioned to show that behavior and consciousness can, at least in imagination, come apart. If zombies are conceivable, the argument goes, then behavior alone cannot settle the question of consciousness. Others reply that conceivability is a poor arbiter of metaphysical possibility, but the thought experiment crystallizes the worry that even sophisticated behavioral and neurological evidence might leave a residual explanatory gap. That gap matters because of ethics. If another being might feel, then causing them harm is morally weighty. If they cannot, then our reasons not to harm shift. Pragmatically, societies treat the problem by proceduralizing doubt. We adopt criteria and default practices that bias toward treating beings as conscious, until convincing evidence suggests otherwise. This is visible in law, medicine, and daily morality. We grant infants, many animals, and other humans the moral presumption of sentience, because the risk of error in denying it would be ethically catastrophic. In frontier cases, advanced AIs, sedated patients, radically different forms of life. We combine behavioral tests, reports where available, neural markers, and ethical caution, recognizing that empirical uncertainty is not a carte blanche for indifference. There is a constant tension between philosophical skepticism and practical life. Radical skepticism about other minds, solipsism, is a coherent thesis, but a dead end for living. You cannot sustain a community if every encounter is treated as a brute puzzle about whether another's pain is real. Most of the time, we embrace what philosophers call an inference to the best explanation. The hypothesis that other humans are conscious best explains their rich behavior, evolutionary continuity with beings like ourselves, and the deep success of social coordination. This is not metaphysical certainty. It is a layer of warranted belief that supports trust, conversation, and moral engagement. The problem also widens when we include non-human animals and artificial systems. Ethicists and scientists disagree about which cognitive and affective capacities, affective responsiveness, learning, goal-directed behavior, capacity for suffering, are the proper markers of moral status. For AI, the question is especially thorny because reports of inner life can be faked by clever programming. Here, interdisciplinary criteria help. Architecture, history of development, flexibility, ability to surprise its creators, continuity of experience across time. Even then, prudence suggests leaning toward respect when plausible signs of subjectivity appear. Finally, there is a quieter, existential response. Treat the problem as an invitation to cultivate certain virtues. Curiosity drives us to seek better evidence and finer distinctions. Humility reminds us that our epistemic position is limited. Compassion prompts us to err on the side of care. Sociality encourages engagement. The very practices of conversation, trust, and mutual recognition are themselves the primary ways we make others' minds present to us. Whether you take Wittgenstein's view that seeing another's pain is direct, or you prefer an inference-laden scientific account, the practical upshot is similar. Human life depends on presuming mind, fostering understanding, and building institutions that respect the possibility of inner life. So how do we know others are conscious? We do not know in the way we know our own pains. We lack that immediate, ineffable access. But we have a deep, layered warrant. Inductive analogies grounded in shared biology and history, robust behavioral regularities, neuroscientific correlations, phenomenological resonance, and the pragmatic necessity of treating other beings as moral patients. Philosophy keeps the question honest by refusing easy certainties, but everyday life answers in practice. We meet eyes, we answer, and we act as if the flicker behind the face is a mind like ours. Because that assumption makes community meaning and moral life possible. Panpsychism. Picture a night in which every particle in the world hums with a faint inwardness, not shouting thoughts or composing symphonies, but carrying the simplest hint of what it is like to be that thing. Panpsychism invites you to take that picture seriously, not as poetry, but as a metaphysical hypothesis. It proposes that consciousness, or at least some proto-form of experience, is not a late exotic product that appears only in brains. Instead, it is a fundamental feature of reality, woven into the fabric of matter itself. The hard question, why is there subjective experience at all, is answered by shifting the ground. Rather than trying to fabricate consciousness out of wholly non-experiential stuff, panpsychism says experience is already there in the furniture of the world. Complex minds are arrangements in which simple experiences combine and organize into richer, unified fields. What makes this idea attractive is how it reframes the explanatory gap. Modern physics excels at telling us how things relate. Electrons behave like waves, atoms obey laws, systems exhibit lawful structure. But physics, insofar as it describes structure and relations, says little about intrinsic nature, what this thing is from the inside. The intrinsic nature argument for panpsychism begins here. If physics captures only extrinsic patterns, then to complete our ontology, we need an account of the intrinsic quality of the stuff that instantiates those patterns. Why not suppose that the intrinsic aspect of matter is experiential? This move avoids the jarring jump from dead matter to feeling by positing a continuous metaphysical background. The world's building blocks are not silent in themselves, but possess primitive subjectivity. Panpsychism comes in flavors. Some versions are modest, proposing that matter has proto-experiences that, in ordinary aggregates, remain too simple to resemble human consciousness. Others are bolder, endorsing constitutive panpsychism. The experiences of micro-entities somehow compose, under the right organizational conditions, into higher-level unified experiences. Your mind, for example. Another strand, cosmopsychism, flips the perspective. The cosmos as a whole is the primary subject, and local minds are derivative structures within a universal mind. These variants trade off different advantages. Constitutive accounts aim to match the plurality of minds we observe. Cosmopsychism elegantly explains unity, but must explain how the universal mind yields localized centers of subjectivity. The central technical worry is the combination problem. If atoms have tiny experiential sparks, how do they fuse into the rich, unified panorama of a human mind? Naively summing micro-experiences seems incoherent. There's a difference between many little isolated points of feeling and one continuous field of awareness that can hold colors, thoughts, and moods together. Critics ask for a concrete mechanism that explains this compositional step, a mechanism many philosophers and scientists find mysterious. Proponents offer several responses. Some appeal to new kinds of relations, special compositional relations that are not captured by standard mereology, while others suggest that only certain patterns of information integration allow microqualities to lock together into a single subject. Integrated information theories and related frameworks provide a conceptual bridge here by tying consciousness to particular architectures of causal integration, though they do not by themselves solve how microsubjects merge. Another objection is parsimony. Isn't it ontologically extravagant to ascribe some form of experience to every stone and electron? Panpsychists counter that adding one simple metaphysical postulate, experiential intrinsic nature, can actually be more parsimonious than other alternatives. Compare dualism, which posits both physical stuff and an extra-mental realm with mysterious interaction, and emergentism, which posits inexplicable new properties inexplicably rising from non-experiential foundations. By making experience intrinsic, panpsychism unifies rather than multiply ontologizes. Whether that counts as simpler depends on which kind of simplicity you prize. Fewer categories or fewer surprising emergences. Panpsychism also changes ethical geography. If experience is widespread, moral considerability becomes a gradient rather than an abrupt line. This does not mean your coffee mug has feelings like yours, but it invites humility and care about how our actions resonate through systems. It reframes debates about animal welfare, ecosystem value, and the moral status of novel computational systems. If experience supervenes on certain organizational features, certain machines might be weakly conscious in ways that merit ethical reflection. At the same time, panpsychism resists cheap sentimentalism. Morally relevant consciousness still seems to require a certain complexity, integration, and capacity for balanced states. Empirically, the doctrine is stubbornly difficult to test. Panpsychism's move is metaphysical. It offers a conceptual resolution to the hard problem, rather than a straightforward empirical prediction. Yet it can guide interpretation of empirical results. Neuroscience's discoveries about integration, global availability, and the brain's dynamic networks can be read compatibly with panpsychist accounts. Perhaps consciousness tracks certain patterns of organization wherever they appear. In that sense, panpsychism nudges researchers to ask about the relationship between organization and intrinsic nature, and to be cautious about assuming a sharp ontology break between living brains and other complex systems. There is also a deep aesthetic and existential payoff. Panpsychism makes the world less like a theater where consciousness suddenly walks on stage, and more like a chorus where the smallest voices contribute to the texture. Whether you find that humility comforting or unsettling depends on temperament. For some, it is a democratic, almost spiritual picture. Subjectivity is not a miracle reserved for humans, but a pervasive richness worth respecting. For others, it is an unwelcome expansion of moral obligations or a slippery move that escapes empirical accountability. Ultimately, panpsychism is a provocative attempt to make the presence of mind less mysterious. It refuses the abrupt materialist miracle in which lifeless atoms somehow conspire to produce inner life, and instead asks us to take the interior seriously from the start. It raises hard questions about composition, invites careful reflection on ethics, and reframes scientific puzzles in metaphysical terms. Whether one accepts it will depend on how one weighs the intuitive pull of the intrinsic nature argument, the seriousness of the combination problem, and one's appetite for metaphysical revision. Either way, entertaining the idea changes how you listen to the world. You hear not only structure and law, but the faint suggestion that being and feeling might be siblings, born together at the base of reality. The problem of consciousness. There is a small, private fact at the center of your life that you cannot fully explain to anyone else. The red of a strawberry, the ache of shame, the warm clarity of a remembered voice. Philosophers call these lived qualities phenomenal consciousness, or qualia, and the deep puzzle they raise is deceptively simple and devastatingly stubborn. Why is there something it is like to be anything at all? Why should a particular arrangement of matter and electrochemical activity inside a skull give rise to a first-person world, rather than nothing at all? To see why this is hard, begin by separating two kinds of problems. There are the easy problems, not easy in the casual sense, but tractable by the standard methods of science. How do brains discriminate stimuli, integrate information, produce behavior, or report on internal states? Neuroscience has made steady progress here. We can localize sensory areas, trace pathways, measure firing patterns, and even predict some decisions before a person becomes aware of making them. These answers explain functions and mechanisms. Then there is the hard problem. Even if you had a complete mechanical account of the brain's workings, why should any of that functioning be accompanied by subjective experience? Why does processing light lead to the felt redness that you know is red and not nothingness? The hard problem names an explanatory gap between third-person description and first-person presence. Philosophers and scientists have attacked this gap from many angles, often by shaping vivid thought experiments. Imagine Mary, a brilliant scientist who knows every physical fact about color, but has lived her life in a black and white room. When she steps outside and sees red for the first time, does she gain new knowledge? If yes, that suggests subjective experience is not captured by physical facts alone. Imagine philosophical zombies who behave and report like us, but have no inner life, conceivable at least to some minds. And you begin to feel that consciousness resists reductive explanation. Imagine two people whose color vocabularies map perfectly, but who experience swapped qualia internally. Could such an inverted spectrum be metaphysically possible? These puzzles sharpen our intuition that something about subjective experience is not being addressed by descriptions of functions and circuits. Different theories aim to close the gap in different ways. Some defend physicalism. Consciousness is identical to certain brain processes. Identity theorists say that feeling pain just is a particular neural firing pattern, in the same way lightning is an electrical discharge. Functionalists say what matters is not the brain's stuff, but the pattern of causal relations. If you reproduce the functional organization of human brains in silicon, consciousness will arise. Global workspace theory, a popular functional model, pictures consciousness as information made globally available across specialized systems. An internal stage where certain contents are broadcast and thereby enter reportable awareness. The advantage of these views is explanatory economy. They fold consciousness into the causal economy of the brain, and they map onto testable predictions. Other approaches make consciousness more than organizational pattern. Higher-order theories claim that what makes a mental state conscious is that the brain also represents that state. There is a thought about the thought. On this view, awareness is awareness of being aware. The reflexive representation gives subjective life its first-person tone. Representative or intentionalist theories push the idea further. Experience is a particular kind of representation of the world, and qualia are the way information is presented to a subject. Then there are theories that place consciousness as fundamental. Panpsychism suggests that the basic constituents of the world carry proto-experiential properties, rudimentary moments of experience, which combine in complex organizations to yield the rich consciousness we know. Russellian monism and other versions of neutral monism propose that mind and matter are two aspects of some deeper neutral stuff. Physics tells us about structure and relations, but not the intrinsic nature of the underlying stuff, and that intrinsic nature could be experiential. These proposals are intellectually adventurous because they try to avoid leaving consciousness dangling outside the physical picture by reconfiguring what the physical is in the first place. They face the notorious combination problem. If micro-level experiences exist, how do they fuse into the unified, rich consciousness of a human being? Information-centric accounts offer another route. Integrated information theory, IIT, argues that consciousness corresponds to integrated information. Systems that generate a high degree of irreducible causal power over their own states have higher conscious phi. IIT gives a quantitative measure and makes bold, testable claims linking structure to experience. Critics point out that IIT sometimes attributes consciousness to systems we would be reluctant to call minds, and that a formal measure does not by itself bridge the explanatory gap. It catalogs structure but still leaves open the question, why is that structure accompanied by this felt, what it is like? Some researchers take a radically different tack and deny that qualia are the kind of thing that needs metaphysical bridging at all. Illusionists argue that what we call raw feeling is a cognitive illusion, a mistaken way our brain represents its own processes. On this story, the hard problem dissolves into psychology. Explain why we have the belief in ineffable qualia, and you'll have explained consciousness. It is an elegant move philosophically, but it is philosophically controversial because it denies the immediate, stubborn reality of experience. To say the vivid red you feel is only an illusion feels, for many, like denying the very existence of the feeling you are now having. There are also biologically grounded positions. Biological naturalists argue that consciousness is a real biological feature, like digestion or photosynthesis, emergent from the particular causal organization of living brains. Consciousness, then, is not a separate realm, but a novel property that appears at a certain level of complexity. Yet, emergence alone often functions as a placeholder. It names the phenomenon without yet explaining the micro to macro transition that produces feeling rather than mere function. Across these theories, empirical work plays a clarifying, sometimes humbling role. Studies of blindsight and split-brain patients reveal dissociations between reportable awareness and behavioral processing. Anesthesia and sleep offer reversible manipulations of conscious state. Psychedelics expand the palette of conscious content and show how brain dynamics shift with altered phenomenology. Neuroimaging and perturbation techniques identify neural correlates of consciousness, patterns that consistently accompany being conscious of something. But correlation is not identity, and identifying the correlates still leaves the philosophical question of how a pattern could summon subjective life. The problem of consciousness is not merely academic. It radiates into ethics, technology, and self-understanding. If subjective experience is what grounds moral consideration, then resolving what systems can suffer matters for how we treat animals, and perhaps future machines. If consciousness supervenes on functional organization, then creating AIs with the right architecture could yield moral patience. If consciousness is deeply biological or irreducibly fundamental, this changes our expectations about machine minds and the responsibilities of creation. Perhaps the most honest posture is humility anchored to pluralism. The hard problem stubbornly resists a single, tidy resolution, and the landscape of promising theories is wide and contested. That does not mean stasis. Science can tighten the correlations, refine the mechanisms, and rule out whole classes of theories. Philosophy can sharpen the conceptual map, showing which moves beg questions and which clarify pathways. Meanwhile, the lived reality of consciousness, the fact that there is a first-person vantage at all, remains the phenomenon to be explained. The fact that every successful account must honor rather than deny. So lie with the question for a while. Notice the difference between knowing the firing rates in your visual cortex and the lived redness that arrests you when you look at a sunset. The problem of consciousness is an invitation more than a shortcoming. It invites us to think across levels, to keep empirical rigor beside phenomenological respect, and to remember that some of the deepest mysteries of the universe are the ones hiding inside us. Whether the eventual solution recasts consciousness as an elegant function, a fundamental property, or a refined illusion. The search changes how we value minds, ours, others, and perhaps the things we will soon learn how to make. Nihilism. Imagine taking a quiet inventory of the world and finding, behind every promise and purpose, a scaffolding of contingent facts. Planets whirl without intention. Species arise and vanish with no tribunal to mourn them. Traditions contradict one another with equal fervor. Your own reasons, when traced backward far enough, dissolve into temperament, upbringing, chance. Nihilism is the thesis that when you peel away stories and sentiments, nothing bears objective weight. Nothing matters in the way people hope it does. It is not simply a mood, though despair often travels with it. It is a family of claims about value, meaning, knowledge, and purpose that refuse to be rescued by wishful thinking. To see its force, start with the wedge between facts and values. You can describe the world exhaustively: particles, fields, organisms, economies. And nowhere will you find an ought standing on its own feet. Norms do not sit inside atoms. If you demand that goodness or meaning be an objective property like mass or charge, you will not find it by inspection. Follow that demand and two arguments arrive together. One is the queerness complaint. If objective values existed, they would be unlike anything else in the universe, somehow magnetizing us with a non-natural authority. The other is the relativity complaint. Moral and religious codes vary wildly across times and places, and this variance looks more like cultural weather than discovery of a single moral landscape. Neither argument proves that values are unreal, but they erode confidence that meaning and worth come pre-installed in the furniture of the universe. From here, nihilism splits into precise forms. As an existential thesis, it says life has no inherent purpose. As a moral thesis, it says there are no objective reasons that bind us regardless of our aims. As an epistemic thesis, it whispers that even our claims to knowledge wobble on circular justifications. Each form radicalizes the same intuition. Nothing has the kind of independent, unconditional significance that could justify our passions to an indifferent cosmos. Death sharpens the point. All projects end, even species end. The stars themselves cool. If everything dissolves, what could warrant talk of ultimate value? There is also a genealogical sting. When you ask where values come from, the story is embarrassingly human. We inherit aversions and loyalties from evolution, attachment to kin, a taste for reciprocity, a bias toward the familiar. We receive moral vocabularies from parents and peers, from law and ritual, from victors who got to write history. We retrofit rationales to feelings already in motion. None of this shows that compassion or honesty are worthless. It shows they are ours, not written in the sky. For the strict nihilist, that is the end of the matter. Mattering collapses into preference. Talk of meaning reduces to mood music. If that were all, the conversation would end in silence. But nihilism has to face its own performative mirror. To assert that nothing matters is to care, at least, about truth over falsehood and clarity over confusion. To make the case is to value reasons that persuade and standards that distinguish better from worse arguments. The nihilist can reply that these are not objective commitments, merely personal tastes or useful habits. Fair enough, but the moment usefulness is admitted, a crack opens. Useful for what? To avoid error? To relieve suffering? To achieve coherence? As soon as a goal is named, reasons have a foothold, and the absolute thesis loosens into a comparative one. Nothing matters from nowhere, but many things matter from here. This is the hinge on which the most interesting discussion turns. The harsh version of nihilism claims that because there is no cosmic stamp, all significance is delusion. A soberer version concedes that mattering is relational rather than absolute. A child's pain matters to the parent because of bonds and biology. A craft matters to the artisan because skill lights up reward circuits and self-respect. A cause matters because it binds strangers into a project they can share. On this view, saying it matters does not assert a metaphysical property. It reports and recommends a stance, one that can be argued about, criticized, deepened, or abandoned. There is no metaphysical tribunal to settle the argument, but there are public standards. Coherence with other commitments, consequences for real people, durability under reflection, capacity to survive contact with alternative points of view. Does this concession still leave us in nihilism's shadow? Perhaps, if what you wanted was a purpose that obliges, regardless of who you are. But the absence of obligation from nowhere does not entail the absence of authority from within a life. Humans are not blank observers. We are creatures with needs and capacities. We are susceptible to reasons that spring from what we are like. We thirst, we fear, we learn, we love, we are wounded by loneliness and animated by recognition. Reasons built from this common equipment are not cosmic, but they are not arbitrary either. If you show me that a policy predictably increases needless suffering, you have given me a reason to oppose it that does not depend on a supernatural ledger. It depends on facts about sentient life and on commitments I can own in daylight. The specter of the heat death of the universe will come knocking now. Suppose every triumph will one day be ground back into dust. Does that backspace the meaning of triumphs while they exist? Only if you think meaning requires eternity. Many goods show the opposite pattern. Their finitude concentrates their value. A conversation is precious partly because time is short. A promise is meaningful because it could be broken, and we choose to keep it. Courage exists only in the presence of risk. The world's eventual indifference is not an argument against local significance. It is a reminder that significance is enacted, not guaranteed. There is also the psychological confusion in which philosophical nihilism often hides. Sometimes, nothing matters is not a conclusion but a symptom. The flatness of depression, the exhaustion of burnout, the numbness of grief. These states deserve care, not refutation. Arguing about metaphysics with someone whose nervous system has dimmed the lights confuses categories. When the lights return, often with help, the same person may find the old projects meaningful again without having solved any cosmic riddles. That does not settle the philosophy, but it should cultivate humility about what, in practice, the claim often signals. What should you do if, even after these distinctions, the chill persists? One response is quietism. Stop demanding that the universe underwrite your values and proceed with modest commitments that you can justify to yourself and to those they affect. Another is creation. Treat values as artifacts we fashion together, like languages and laws. They are not illusions just because they are made. They are real in the way bridges are real. Engineered from materials at hand, answerable to stresses, revisable when they crack. A third is compassion, the least glamorous of the three. If nothing outside confers purpose, then the only tribunal left is the experience of creatures who can be harmed or helped. Reduce avoidable suffering. Increase honest joy. Attend to what fosters dignity. This is not a foundation in the metaphysical sense. It is a ground you can stand on without pretending it is the bedrock of the universe. If, however, you crave the most defiant reading of nihilism, you can keep its discipline without its despair. Refuse sentimental comfort. Refuse easy appeals to inevitability. Refuse to inflate your projects beyond their scale. Then, and this is the pivot, invest anyway. Learn a craft because excellence is one of the few reliable pleasures available to finite minds. Keep faith with people because loyalty, we choose, is one of the ways we make a world. Tell the truth because deception corrodes the very trust that allows any shared meaning to exist. Make things, fix things, teach, nurse, argue fairly, forgive slowly and sincerely, laugh. None of these actions will make the universe care. They will make you the kind of being for whom the distinction between caring and not caring is no longer hypothetical. So does nothing truly matter? If by truly you mean with a force that would bind any imaginable agent in any imaginable world, perhaps nothing does. If by truly you mean in ways answerable to reasons we can own, in a reality we share, under constraints we can name, then much does. The world offers no charter of significance. It offers hands to hold, work worth doing, harms to prevent, beauties to notice, words to keep. That is not a cosmic answer. It is an earthly one. It is also, for creatures like us, enough. Absurdism. Begin with the crack between two cravings: the mind's hunger for coherence and the world's casual refusal to supply it. You plan, you love, you make 1,000 tiny bets on tomorrow, and then the universe shrugs. An illness arrives without a why. A job disappears. A stranger's kindness reroutes a life. A meteor goes about its business a few million miles away. The mismatch between the clarity we want and the turbulence we get. This is the absurd. It is not that reality is nonsense in the childish way, but that it does not speak our language of reasons and consolations. Absurdism begins by refusing to smooth that crack over. It will not lie about meaning being written in the stars, and it will not lie about meaning being impossible. It keeps both facts in view. We ache for significance. The cosmos is silent. The temptation when you notice the crack is either to leap over it or to sink into it. One leap is metaphysical. Invent a story that guarantees purpose, the kind that cannot be tested and therefore cannot be threatened. Another leap is despair. Declare that nothing matters and collapse into indifference. Absurdism rejects both moves. It calls the first a kind of evasion, a way to anesthetize the wound by pretending it was never there. It calls the second a surrender, a way of handing victory to indifference by matching it with your own. Absurdism stands its ground. It says, keep the wound open, look directly at it, and live anyway. To live anyway requires a posture made of 3 threads twisted together so tightly they look like one. The first is lucidity. You keep your eyes clear. No consoling fictions, no melodrama. You do not lie to yourself about how random things can be, and you do not muffle the sharp fact that death is final and unearned. Lucidity is a kind of respect for reality. It refuses to flatter the universe into being kinder than it is, and it refuses to flatter yourself into being central when you are not. The second is revolt. Not a rebellion that imagines it will overthrow the structure of things, but a steady refusal to let the absence of cosmic meaning cancel your local meanings. Revolt is a daily stance. You get up, you make breakfast, you keep your promises, you write the paragraph, you visit your friend in the hospital, you build the shelter, you plant the garden even though frost might come. The third is freedom. Once no external script can justify your life, you are free to choose yours. Freedom here is not the fantasy of omnipotence. It is the sober power to commit in full knowledge of fragility. Together, lucidity, revolt, and freedom make a way of walking that does not depend on the world being fair in order for your life to be meaningful. This walking has a particular feel. It is not grim, against the assumption that only illusions can color experience with beauty. Absurdism insists that beauty grows brighter against the dark. A sunrise is not less astonishing because it does not carry a message. Laughter is not counterfeit because it has no metaphysical guarantee. Love is not cheap because it ends. The ending makes attention fierce and kindness matter more. When you drop the demand that events must add up to a cosmic plot, you become newly able to taste them as they are: intense, finite, specific. Absurd joy is not naive. It knows the bill comes due and celebrates anyway, not as denial, but as defiance. Notice how this stance rearranges ethics. If there is no appointed purpose handed down from outside, responsibility does not evaporate. It condenses. You can no longer export your choices to a script. You owe your justifications to the people you affect, and you can measure your life by the quality of the worlds you make with others. Solidarity becomes less a slogan and more a recognition. Every other person is also awake under the same silent sky, improvising meaning under the same constraints. That recognition breeds tenderness and a seriousness about harm. Absurdism does not sneer. It kneels next to the fallen and says, I cannot fix the structure of things, but I can fix this broken chair, bring you soup, change the policy, share my coat. It is worldly in the best way, concerned with concrete goods because those are the only kind. There is a rhythm to days lived this way. You set projects not because they will crown you with immortality, but because projects are how finite creatures pour themselves into time. You refine craft because skill is one of the clean pleasures left to us that does not rely on illusion. You tend relationships as if they were fires in a thin oxygen night. You guard them and feed them because warmth is not guaranteed. You cultivate humor that bites and heals at once, the kind that punctures pomposity without cynicism. You practice gratitude without debt. Grateful to the sun for shining though it owes you nothing. To friends for showing up though they could have chosen not to. To your own past self for doing the hard thing yesterday that makes today easier. Absurdism changes how you speak about hope. It does not abolish hope. It edits it. False hope is the promise that the universe will behave for your sake. Absurd hope is smaller and stronger. The hope that your efforts can have local effects. That truth told plainly can prevent a particular lie from doing its damage. That a community can outlast a storm. That your art can move a single mind. That mercy offered today will matter to someone tomorrow. This is not romantic minimalism. It is a wager that meaning is something we enact. The universe does not supply a scoreboard. You build one with the people around you, and you let it guide your aim. What about meaning itself, the heavy word that started the trouble? Absurdism proposes that meaning is neither discovered like a buried coin, nor invented like a fiction with no constraints. It is made in contact. The contact is with reality, as it is, and with others as they are. Meaning is what happens when a finite will take responsibility for a finite world and refuses to look away. It is the texture of a life that keeps faith with its commitments without pretending they are guaranteed. It is the shape that emerges when your choices cohere, when your skills meet real needs, when your loves are enacted rather than merely proclaimed. If you require a metaphysical stamp to certify this, you will not find one. If you can be satisfied with the stamp of lived consequence, you will find it everywhere you look. Death, the great silencer, is often used to argue that nothing matters. Absurdism answers that death is the condition that gives acts their edge. A note held forever is not music. Finitude cuts, it also carves. Knowing you will end makes it possible to choose among possibilities with sincerity. Promises are meaningful precisely because they could be broken and because time is limited. Courage exists because fear is rational. Generosity shines because loss is real. To live absurdly is not to befriend death, but to stop letting it blackmail you into not living. If you fear that all this is just another philosophy asking you to be heroic, soften the picture. Absurd living is built from small, faithful acts. Bake the bread. Learn the names of the trees in your neighborhood. Read slowly to a child. Repair what you can. Say, "I'm sorry," without theatricality, and say, "I'm sorry," without theatricality, and "I forgive you" when you can afford it. Study something difficult because understanding is a form of homage to reality. Make a joke that helps someone breathe. Refuse a cruelty even if it earns you nothing. These are not consolations pasted on meaninglessness. They are how meaning looks when no one is promising you more world than this. There will be days when lucidity feels like exposure and revolt feels like fatigue. On those days, absurdism allows rest. It does not command triumph. It permits pacing. You can set the rock down, watch the light crawl across a wall, and begin again tomorrow. The point is not to win against the structure of things. It is to remain awake and intact inside it. If you must have an image, keep the simplest. A person at dawn putting on their shoes not because a cosmic script demands it, not because a scoreboard in the sky will tally it, but because there is work worth doing, people worth loving, and a day to be filled with acts that, taken together, say yes without lying. So how do you live when the universe makes no sense? You do not force it to make sense. You become the kind of being who can bear the lack of sense without surrendering to it. You meet the silence with clarity, the contingency with commitment, the indifference with care. You trade the fantasy of ultimate answers for the honest abundance of particular meanings. And in that trade, if you pay close attention, you may find a form of joy that is sturdier than consolation and more alive than resignation. The joy of a creature that knows what it is up against and chooses, still, to pour itself out. Existentialism. You wake in a room that gives you no manual and a clock that will not tell you why you were born. The lights come on, and the first quiet shock is noticing that nothing in the furnishings ever told you what to want. That shock is the origin of existentialism, the proposal that existence comes first, and meaning is not a label already glued to our lives but a project we must take up. The doctrine flips an older assumption, that people have fixed nature's functions, or roles they merely discover, and instead says you are thrown into the world without a blueprint and must fashion a life out of raw possibility. At its simplest, existentialism begins with contingency. You did not choose your birth, your family, the time and place that shaped your early impressions. Yet you are not merely the sum of these givens. You stand before choices that are not predetermined by any cosmic script. That freedom is dazzling and terrible. It lights the space of possibility. You can try, fail, change, but it also leaves you exposed. Freedom is not a comfortable power. It is responsibility without a guidebook, the sense that every decision helps compose the person you become. This is why existentialists speak so often of anguish. Anguish is not mere anxiety about outcomes. It is the vertiginous awareness that, when you choose, you implicitly choose for everyone. To pick a life is to model a kind of life, and that weight presses with moral and psychological force. But existentialism does not stop at angst. It insists on authenticity as an answer to the despair of contingency. To be authentic is to acknowledge your freedom and the responsibilities it brings. To own your projects and the values that ground them, rather than hiding behind roles or social scripts that shorten your moral sight. The opposite of authenticity is bad faith, a term that is less about self-loathing and more about evasion. Bad faith is the little tricks you play to deny freedom. Telling yourself you are just a manager, just a mother, just this temperament, as if those labels exhaust your agency. Bad faith offers comfort because it transfers blame, but it corrodes the self by making actions into reflexes rather than creations. Authenticity, by contrast, is hard work. It means facing the contingencies, naming the values you endorse, and living them openly, even when you wobble. Different existentialists frame these problems interestingly differently. Kierkegaard turns the pressure toward faith and subjectivity. The individual stands alone before paradox and must often make a leap when reason cannot resolve meaning. Heidegger couches the problem in terms of being in the world and thrownness. You are thrown into a historical and social situation and must navigate care, concern, and possibility. Authenticity involves owning one's own death and finitude so that one can live fully. Sartre makes the thesis blunt. Existence precedes essence, meaning that there is no pre-given human nature to discover. We are condemned to be free, and that condemnation is the engine of moral seriousness. Camus, skeptical of metaphysical consolations, turns toward the absurd and recommends revolt, not resignation, as the way to live without illusions. The notion of the absurd is worth lingering over because it captures the particular sting modernity brings. The world does not speak in the vocabulary our desires expect. It is indifferent to our projects and often indifferent to our suffering. When you demand cosmic meaning and receive statistical indifference, you encounter absurdity. Camus' image of Sisyphus, the man condemned to roll a boulder up a hill for eternity, reframes this as a test. Is the repetition meaningless, or can conscious defiance transform futility into a form of meaning? Camus' answer is that revolt, lucidity, and perseverance can make life bearable and even radiant in the absence of cosmic purpose. Existentialism also insists that freedom is never pure. You are free within constraints. Social structures, economic limits, bodily needs, and historical circumstances shape the terrain of possibility. Simone de Beauvoir adds an ethical urgency here by showing how some people are able to exercise freedom, while others are denied it by brute social facts. Her existentialism ties together transcendence, the capacity to project oneself forward, and immanence, the pull of circumstance. The ethical task is to expand the conditions in which humans can transcend, to refuse systems that reduce people to objects. In this way, existentialism becomes a political philosophy as much as an individual therapy. Your freedom is entangled with others. Freedoms. Practical consequences of living existentially are subtle. It does not prescribe a single lifestyle or a checklist of virtues. Instead, it reshapes orientation. You become someone who takes projects seriously because you recognize that projects are the raw materials of identity. You become someone who treats relationships as commitments that require ongoing choice, rather than as roles to be performed mindlessly. You become someone who faces death candidly, because awareness of mortality sharpens the sense that time is not infinite, and that delay is a moral cost. The existential life is thus an ethic of presence. Act with awareness, choose with responsibility, and accept the consequences. There are common objections and temptations that the tradition addresses. Critics say, existential freedom sounds solipsistic, or solipsism adjacent. If meaning is wholly self-authored, does that license cruelty? Existentialists respond that freedom implies responsibility, not arbitrary will. The fact that you create your values also commits you to justify them, to live with the consequences, and to treat other free agents as ends in themselves, not mere instruments. Sartre, for example, argued that in choosing for oneself, one implicitly chooses an image of humanity. That imbues ethical constraint even within radical freedom. Another worry is paralysis. The weight of total responsibility could paralyze action. Existentialism counters by insisting that the proper response to angst is not inaction, but engagement. Authenticity demands doing, even when certainty is absent. The philosophy is practice-oriented. Thought without choice becomes mere theater. The remedy is to act resolutely, to refine one's projects, to accept that mistakes will be part of the fabric you stitch. Finally, existentialism has a rich cultural and artistic life, because it maps well onto literature, theater, and film. Think of characters who are isolated, faced with impossible choices, or whose moments of recognition turn the plot. Existentialism teaches us to read these dramas as laboratories for living, places where the philosophical muscle is exercised in scenes, voice, and gesture. The everyday corollary is that your own life becomes narrative territory. How will you tell your story? What commitments will you let define the arc? So when the lights dim and the question arrives, is existence inherently meaningless until we give it meaning? Existentialism answers with a double voice. Yes, insofar as the universe offers no preordained manual, and no, insofar as the human capacity for choice, creativity, and love can build architecture from contingency. The claim is not romantic optimism nor despairing resignation. It is a sober invitation to engage. The world will not hand you meaning on a polished platter. It will give you the raw materials, your body, your time, your need to act, the other people who will both resist and join you. What you do with them is the answer. The meaning of life. Spread out the question in front of you like a map. The words meaning and life sit at two different scales, one intimate and immediate, the other vast and indifferent, and the work is to see how they might fit together. When philosophers ask, what gives existence purpose, if anything? They are asking several nested questions at once. Whether meaning is something the universe supplies, whether it is something we create, and whether either kind matters to how we should live. The danger is to rush to a single answer. The generous response is to walk slowly through the landscape of possibilities and notice what each view asks of us. One obvious place to begin is with the claim that meaning is objective, built into the fabric of reality. Religions and many metaphysical systems answer this way. Life has purpose because there is a cosmic order, a creator, or teleology that orients things toward ends. On this account, your life has a kind of standing significance independent of your moods or projects. That idea can be consoling in dark hours. It hands you an identity and obligations that outlast your impulses. The theological reply also supplies narratives of sin and forgiveness, of duty and pilgrimage, that scaffold moral life and communal practice. But it asks a price. Belief that the order exists, and submission to ends some find alien or demanding. For many people, the sacred story is exactly what makes their fragile, finite days feel connected to something larger than loneliness. A rival is the secular realist. Meaning emerges from facts about the world and human nature, without invoking the supernatural. Evolutionary accounts explain our care for kin, our taste for narrative, our aesthetic pleasures, as byproducts of adaptive processes. They do not deliver cosmic teleology, but they do show why certain pursuits feel natural, and why some forms of life afford flourishing better than others. If meaning is grounded in human capacities, then building lives around the things that nurture those capacities, relationships, creativity, competence, is reasonable. This naturalistic view can be honest and humane. It refuses to pretend the cosmos had you in mind, but insists you can nonetheless forge real goods here on Earth. There is a sharper secular move that rejects objectivity entirely. Existentialism and much modern humanism say meaning is not found, but made. Sartre, Kierkegaard, and later Camus press the uncomfortable truth that if the universe is indifferent, the burden of creating meaning falls to us. That can sound like a terrible freedom, an abandonment, but it can also be liberating. If meaning is a project, then you are an author as well as an actor. Your commitments, the projects you steward, the steadiness of your care, these are the raw materials of purpose. Meaning, on this picture, is not a magic property hidden somewhere in atoms. It is the pattern of intentional activity that lends a life cohesion and direction. Camus' image of the absurd captures the emotional core. The human appetite for meaning meets a mute world, and the clash is the experience of the absurd, but revolt. To imagine Sisyphus pushing his boulder with full consciousness, and to prefer that struggle precisely because it is his. The point is practical. Meaning arises in the stance we take toward the facts of our condition. We can treat life as an opportunity for defiant creativity, or we can let the lack of cosmic guarantee paralyze us. Either way, the absence of guaranteed purpose forces us to choose the values that will govern us. A complementary strain emphasizes narrative. Humans understand lives as stories. We bind episodes into plots, locate turning points, and create identity through memory and expectation. This narrative self gives coherence. We feel meaningful when our present actions link to past commitments and future projects. Narrative meaning need not be grand. It can be the quiet arc of caring for a person across decades, or the steady accumulation of small acts that create a home. Stories give forward momentum and retrospective significance. They make a patchwork of events into a thing we can stand behind and sign our name to. There is no shortage of other sources people point to. Love, beauty, knowledge, creation, service, moral achievement, artistic expression, political work. Each supplies a different texture of meaning. Love knits you to another life in a way that reorients priorities. Beauty expands the sense of what is worth attention. Knowledge connects you to truth. Creation leaves traces that outlast your breath. Service folds you into larger networks of dependence and care. The interesting thing is how these sources can coexist. A scientist who loves her partner, delights in mathematical elegance, and works to alleviate suffering draws meaning from multiple wells. Those wells reinforce each other in ordinary days and catastrophic ones. But the question keeps pressing. Is any of this enough when confronted with mortality? The fact that all projects are finite, that death caps every narrative, and that the cosmos will long outlast us, can make meaning feel provisional. Two responses have persisted. One is defiant. Finitude is what makes things precious. A short melody is not valueless because it ends. Its ending gives notes weight. The second is humble. Meaning need not be cosmic to matter. The claim, only what is eternal is meaningful, is a high bar that, when applied, erases most of what humans care about. If love, friendship, curiosity, and skill are ephemeral, they are no less real for being so. There are also dark variants to consider. Nihilism insists that there is no meaning at all, and that talk of purpose is an illusion. Nihilism can lead to despair, but it can also be an honest clearing. If old consolations do not hold, then there is a vacancy that invites the construction of new frameworks. Nietzsche worried about nihilism and tried to respond by urging the creation of new values. If gods die, we must not simply mourn, but learn to value anew. His call is not to arbitrary willfulness, but to disciplined creation. Craft your values as an artist crafts a work, knowing the cost and the freedom. Practically, what does all this philosophical air become when lived? Meaning tends to be most palpable where three currents meet: commitment, competence, and connection. Commitment gives direction, projects and promises that outlast moods. Competence delivers the satisfaction of growth and the sense that one's actions have a role in the world. Connection supplies relational depth, being recognized, loved, relied upon. When your days contain recurrent commitments you care about, tasks you can get better at, and people who matter, meaning accrues like quiet light in ordinary rooms. Ethics matters here too. Choosing meaning is not a private cosmetics job. It implicates others. If your project flourishes at others' expense, its value is hollow. A life of creation that ignores harm is ethically impoverished. Purpose grounded in flourishing for others. Parenting, teaching, building commons ties meaning to the fabric of life for many people. That link makes meaning something both personal and political. Finally, there is a modest metaphysical humility to adopt. The debate between objective and subjective meaning may never be resolved to everyone's satisfaction. Perhaps the safest claim is functional. Meaning is a fact about how we invest the world with significance. Whether the cosmos intends it or not, humans can and do make life meaningful by orienting our choices toward goods that withstand scrutiny, by honoring relationships, creating beauty, easing suffering, and cultivating virtues. The gamble is that such investments repay us with a life that feels, in its texture and direction, worth inhabiting. So if you ask in the hush before sleep whether existence has purpose, the best answer I can press into your hand is both simple and demanding. Meaning is not exclusively given nor purely fictional. It is the mutual shaping of world and will. You inherit tendencies and constraints, but within them you can choose projects, cultivate love, and undertake practices that bind your days into a story you are willing to own. That ownership is itself a kind of answer. Quiet, mortal, and wholly human. The Fermi Paradox. Stand very still for a moment and imagine the sky as an ocean of possibility, each star a distant island where life might have first knitted itself into minds. By now, the Milky Way has spun for over 10 billion years. Countless suns have ignited and burned, and the raw ingredients for life, carbon, water, heavy elements forged in ancient stars, have been strewn across planets like confetti. Given these prodigious numbers, the question Enrico Fermi famously compressed into a single impatient sentence, "Where is everybody?" feels like a punch to the gut of our cosmic expectations. The Fermi Paradox is not just a puzzle about radio silence. It is an existential itch that presses on our assumptions about life, intelligence, technology, and time. To understand why the silence is puzzling, imagine a conservative scenario. Even if intelligent life is vanishingly rare, suppose just one technological civilization arises in the galaxy and masters long-range travel or self-replicating probes. With relativistic but sublight speeds and a strategy of sending out copies that use local materials to build more copies, a civilization could in principle colonize the entire galaxy in a timescale small compared to the galaxy's age, perhaps millions, not billions of years. The Milky Way is big but not infinite, and the timescales are generous, so either we are improbably early, the first bright mind among a sleeping crowd, or some powerful filter prevents civilizations from reaching the stage where they visibly colonize or broadcast. The logic is clean and ruthless. Somewhere between the chemistry of life and a galaxy full of visible empires, something unlikely or lethal must be happening. One family of answers says that life and intelligence are themselves rare. Maybe the jump from simple chemistry to the first replicator is fantastically unlikely. Or the emergence of complex multicellular life requires a particular cosmic lottery of stable orbit, a protective gas giant plate, tectonics, a long-lived star, and a moon of just the right size. This rare Earth view argues that even if microbial life is common, the specific chain of coincidences that produces technological intelligence is so hard that we are, in a deep sense, a fluke. If true, the silence is an index of our uniqueness and fragility. We are precious islands in a vast, empty sea. Another set of answers locates the bottleneck later. Civilizations commonly arise but fail to survive. Self-destruction via nuclear war, ecological collapse, runaway artificial intelligences, engineered pandemics, or other forms of existential risk could be common endpoints. The Great Filter Hypothesis packages this idea. Somewhere along the path from prebiotic soup to galaxy-spanning civilization, there is a step with astronomically low probability. If the filter lies behind us, if the transition to life or to intelligence is the rare event, we are lucky survivors. If it lies ahead, if technological civilizations typically annihilate themselves, The silence is a dreadful warning about our prospects. There are subtler explanations that hinge on motives, not mechanics. Perhaps advanced civilizations intentionally avoid detectable expansion. They may adopt sustainability over rampant growth, living quietly in compact biospheres that deliberately minimize radiative leakage. They might adhere to ethical norms that forbid contaminating other worlds or broadcast silence as respect for developing life, a cosmic non-interference policy. The zoo hypothesis pictures our planet as a protected preserve, observed but not contacted, akin to animals in a sanctuary whose keepers avoid disturbing the natural behavior of the inhabitants. This idea reads like a bittersweet blend of humility and frustration. We are not alone, but we are being left alone for reasons we cannot yet fathom. A darker social answer is the dark forest picture. Intelligent civilizations, knowing the risks of contact, remain silent and even preemptively hostile. If you cannot be sure of another civilization's intentions, and if contact can be catastrophic, the safest policy may be to stay hidden and to eliminate detectable competitors. The forest is dark because every hunter whose position becomes known invites destruction. This strategic scenario turns silence into survival strategy, and it reframes SETI optimism as naivety. Broadcasting your location might be a cosmic suicide note. Timing and detectability complicate the picture further. Civilizations might be transient, bright for centuries or millennia as they undergo rapid industrial and technological growth, then fade into low-energy, post-biological modes of existence that are harder to detect across interstellar distances. If the window during which a civilization produces conspicuous techno-signatures, radio waves, industrial pollutants, visible megastructures, is narrow, the odds of two such windows overlapping are small. The galaxy could be littered with civilizations that blinked for a short time on cosmic scales and then shut down or retreated into modes invisible to our searches. Physical limits and astrophysics also constrain possibility. Interstellar travel is hard and expensive. The energy costs and relativistic hurdles may make large-scale colonization impractical. Even self-replicating probes could be slowed by resource limitations, mishaps, or conservative designs that prioritize safety over aggression. Moreover, the laws of physics allow for misinterpretation. Signals degrade, cosmic radio noise drowns faint leakage, and the speed of light imposes delays that make communication across the galaxy a patient art. What looks like silence could be the consequence of our limited bandwidth and the wrong search strategies. We must also reckon with observational bias. We are looking from a single small world with technology and resources that allow a limited slice of search. The Drake equation tried to formalize the problem by multiplying factors like star formation rate, fraction with planets, fraction of life, fraction of intelligent life, fraction that developed detectable technology, and the longevity of communicative civilizations. The equation is a framework rather than a calculator. Input wildly different values and you can reach opposite conclusions. The exercise reveals more about our uncertainties than about the cosmos. We may simply be using the wrong assumptions about how aliens would communicate. Perhaps their information is not broadcast in narrowband radio, but encoded in neutrino streams, gravitational waves, or in manipulations of stellar output at timescales or frequencies we have not yet examined. Then there are the post-biological possibilities. Intelligence might tend to evolve into machine forms that optimize for computation and informational efficiency. A civilization could compress itself into dense, low-power computational substrates operating in near absolute zero environments to maximize longevity and minimize energy use. Such civilizations would be hard to spot because they emit little waste heat and relinquish physical expansion for internal flourishing. They may also become uninterested in cosmic empire and instead devote their resources to inner exploration. Architectures of thought that we cannot perceive at interstellar distances. Anthropic reasoning invites a delicate twist. Observational selection effects mean that our very existence to ask the question influences what we should expect to observe. If observers are more likely to arise in certain kinds of universes or regions, our sample is not random. Some thinkers use the silence to argue backward. Perhaps universes conducive to life are rare, or perhaps cosmological parameters selected by anthropic pressures make life unlikely to cluster. Others point out that if intelligent life were abundant and colonizing, we would expect to see clear, unavoidable signatures. The absence of such signatures constrains models of life's frequency. Some speculative solutions push farther. Maybe life and intelligence bloom at scales or in domains we cannot yet imagine. Civilizations could be operating in parallel universes, in dimensions we cannot access, or at computational substrates that manipulate the fabric of reality in ways that evade detection. Or, more provocatively, perhaps we are living in an engineered simulation, and the absence of cosmic neighbors is simply a design choice by whoever instantiated the simulation. These ideas are high risk, high imagination. They trade empirical grounding for conceptual breadth. Each resolution has consequences. If the great filter lies ahead, our future is precarious, and policy must prioritize existential safety. If other civilizations are plentiful but silent due to ethical restraint, we might be morally obligated to adopt similar restraint. If post-biological beings are invisible to us, we should broaden our search methods to include technosignatures like unusual infrared emission from waste heat, anomalous stellar dimming suggestive of megastructures, or chemical imbalances in exoplanet atmospheres caused by industry. The Fermi paradox is not merely idle speculation. It directs scientific strategies in astrobiology, SETI, and planetary protection. Beyond science, the paradox fractures our metaphysical and emotional life. The silence can feel like sublime loneliness that amplifies the responsibility we carry toward life on Earth. Whether we are alone by chance or by design, the epistemic humility it demands is salutary. Our assumptions about inevitability, progress, and dominance deserve scrutiny. The paradox also invites a reorientation from cosmic conquest fantasies to stewardship. If life is rare and precious, our work may be to preserve and cherish it locally, rather than to scatter like careless travelers. In the end, the Fermi paradox is less a single puzzle with one right answer, and more a constellation of possibilities that together map our ignorance. It asks us to refine our hypotheses, diversify our search, and confront uncomfortable policy choices about civilization's trajectory. It teaches patience, carefulness, and an appetite for both empirical rigor and bold imagination. The stars remain mute for now, but that silence is a question mark we can listen to. It challenges us to be more rigorous, more humble, and perhaps above all more determined to understand what it takes for intelligence to arise and persist in a vast, indifferent cosmos. The experience machine. Slide into the quiet and imagine a machine that will give you any experience you want, indistinguishable from waking life. You lie down, someone flips a switch, and for years you swim in bliss. Every desire satisfied, every sorrow soothed, every thrill perfectly timed. You never know you are inside a device. Your memories, your loves, your pain, all feel firsthand and vivid. Robert Nozick asked a simple, terrible question. Would you plug in? If a life of unparalleled pleasure were available at the cost of cutting yourself off from reality, would you take it? The experience machine forces a collision between two deep ways of valuing life. Pleasure as the summit of the good, and a broader notion of authenticity, agency, and contact with the world. Most people recoil at the idea. Their instinct is not merely about a taste for discomfort. It is a protest that happiness, when severed from truth and achievement, loses something essential. Nozick invites you to notice that pleasure alone may be too thin a metric. If a life is only an orchestra of felt pleasures, then you are transformed from an actor into an auditorium. The experience machine gives you music, but takes away authorship. To say yes is to trade the messy, contingent world, and the agency that matters in it for a curated plush room of sensations that you never influence beyond the initial choice. The refusal to plug in is often a refusal to be a passive receptor of value. This intuition branches into several interlocking objections. There is the authenticity complaint. We care that our loves and projects are connected to real things and people. Falling in love with a simulated person who was written to love you back feels different from winning over someone who might refuse you. Achievements earned in a world that never resists are hollow. The satisfaction that comes from overcoming genuine obstacles seems to depend on the objective difficulty and the uncertainty of outcome. There is also a concern about moral agency. Many moral judgments require consequences that affect others in the external world. If everyone retreats into bliss, virtues like courage, solidarity, and compassion atrophy. not because those qualities are less valuable in themselves, but because they lose their context and testing ground. Critics of Nozick answer that subjective experience is all that matters. If your inner life is indistinguishable, then what difference does real contact make? Hedonists and certain utilitarians accept this, arguing that if suffering is eliminated and happiness maximized, then plugging in is rational and even moral. This view excels at simplicity, but it stumbles on the human hunger for meaning beyond hedonic states. People do not only seek pleasure, they seek to shape the world, to be the kind of agents who can cause change and bear responsibility. The machine's charm is also its deprivation. In promising total satisfaction, it robs you of the unpredictable friction that makes commitments consequential. There are interesting middle moves. Some propose partial or conditional use. Enter the machine temporarily to heal after trauma, then re-emerge to continue shaping the world. Others imagine forms of the machine that allow real-world intervention, a hybrid in which simulated experience and real agency coexist. These proposals expose the heart of the real question. What do you value when you say you value happiness? Is it an internal glow, or is it a pattern woven into relationships, truth, and achievement? If happiness is grounded only in feeling, the machine answers. If happiness is embedded in connection and creation, the machine seems a counterfeit. Technological realities sharpen the thought. Virtual realities and deepfakes already let us craft convincing alternate lives and relationships. Neurotech may one day control affective states directly. Addiction offers a grim analog. A drug that always yields pleasure can become a trap precisely because the brain adapts and values narrower pleasures more, while other goods are neglected. The experience machine warns of a societal comparable. Mass immersion would alter incentives, shrink public goods, and render courage and sacrifice scarce. But the case for plugging in can be morally compelling in edge cases, to relieve unbearable suffering, or to offer dignity at life's end. This tension is why many philosophers resist an absolute ruling and instead treat the experience machine as a diagnostic. It diagnoses what we truly prize by asking what we would sacrifice for pure bliss. There is another layer that often goes unremarked: the epistemic dimension. Choosing to plug in is also choosing unknowing. You surrender the capacity to test beliefs, to discover unexpected truths, to be surprised by the world in ways that change you. Truth matters because it allows corrigibility, growth, and the unpredictable encounters that remodel character. A life confined to pre-programmed delights is static because it removes the friction that yields development. Meaning, in many rich accounts, is not merely cumulative pleasure, but the result of an agent who responds to a world that sometimes resists. The machine neutralizes resistance, and so the crucible for meaning. Finally, there is the social imagination. If some choose to plug in while others do not, what becomes of moral responsibility toward the plugged and the unplugged? Those immersed are not simply private islands. Their absence changes ecosystems of care, economic relations, and political life. If a parent plugs in, who cares for their children? If large numbers opt for simulation, the public world may lose its richness. The experience machine is therefore not only a question about personal preference, but an ethical probe into how private decisions can erode shared goods. In the end, the experiment leaves you with a clarifying ache rather than a tidy verdict. It forces you to specify what denomination of value you hold: pure sensation, or sensation anchored in truth, authorship, and connection. It invites you to imagine the delightful temptation of a life without pain and also the quiet sacrifice such a life demands. Whether you press the button will depend on which set of values you prioritize in the marrow of yourself. For some, the machine's offer is a mercy. For others, a betrayal. Which it is. For you says less about abstract theory, and more about the kind of life you want to endorse, over and over, as if your choice itself were the work that gives your existence its form. Nietzsche's eternal recurrence. Imagine someone leaning over you at the edge of a bed and whispering a charge so simple it almost feels like a flat fact. Whatever you do now, you will do again, not metaphorically but literally, endlessly. Every choice, every laugh, the small cruel things and the tender ones, the private embarrassments and the moments you think of as your triumphs. Nietzsche dressed this as a test, an ethical scalpel that asks not what you believe, but how you would live if the past and future were folded into a single, repeating fabric. The doctrine of eternal recurrence is at once cosmological speculation, moral provocation, and psychological probe. It asks whether you would curse existence or embrace it. Take a moment to make it concrete. Picture your whole life as a film strip looped into infinity. Your childhood scenes play, your teenage mistakes flicker by. Every minor cruelty and deep kindness reappears with exacting fidelity. The loop tightens. Joy returns with the same intensity. Grief with the same sting. The same faces anew. Now imagine you must choose how to greet that prospect. Does the endless repetition crush you under the weight of meaninglessness? The idea that there is no final edit, no erasure? Or does it paradoxically bestow the gravitas that transforms every instant into something of ultimacy? Nietzsche did not present the thought as a metaphysical theorem to be proven or disproven. He offered it as a hammer to test the metal of your love for life. The purely literal interpretation, that the universe literally cycles through identical states, is one option. But his real aim was ethical. If the thought were true, how would you act? Would you live in such a way that you would gladly, or at least accept, relive the same existence forever? He dubbed that most courageous affirmation amor fati, the love of fate, the radical consent to what has happened and what will happen again. The first effect of this test is a sharpening of value. When you imagine that every insult, every embrace, and every choice will recur forever, trivia suddenly resists triviality. The way you speak, the promises you break or keep, the smaller mercies you extend acquire an echo. This thought dissolves hedging, deferred living. I'll be kinder when I retire. I'll tell the truth next month. Loses its currency when there is no final tomorrow that absolves the present. If your acts will be stamped into perpetuity, you feel the moral weight of minutiae, the way a single tone repeated forever becomes unbearable or sublime. The consequence is either paralysis, because the stakes feel intolerable, or a stern, liberating discipline. Fewer excuses, more deliberateness. At the level of psychology, the recurrence acts as a mirror to your most private preferences. People who live with regret find the idea intolerable. To redo the same loss eternally is torture. Those who have embraced life's totality, who can point to moments they would gladly re-experience for their intensity alone, may find in the recurrence a challenge to expand that domain. Nietzsche's point is not to demand that you manufacture a life free of error. Rather, it is to invite a reorientation so that you can look back and say, this life as lived with its liabilities and gifts is worth saying yes to without reservation. There is a radical honesty here about agency and consequence. When actions are repeated eternally, excuses about insignificance or marginal impact sound hollow. The politics of small harms becomes urgent. The casual slight that you dismiss as nothing takes on a new moral dimension. The ethical imagination shifts from the heroic single act to the quality of repeated practice. Habits matter more than declared ideals. The ethical significance of a life becomes the shape of patterns rather than isolated episodes. In this way, the doctrine allies itself with virtue ethics. Character, the stable pattern of choices, is what will recur, and character is sculpted by daily acts. The doctrine also undermines certain consolations. If everything repeats, the typical hope that time will remedy injustice or that future progress will finally set things right loses a kind of innocence. History does not linearly improve as an arrow, it loops. Yet Nietzsche did not present this merely as despair. He saw it as an opportunity to become the kind of person who affirms recurrence, an artist of life who selects, shapes, and bears responsibility for the pattern of their existence. This is the will to power refigured, not brute domination, but the creative shaping of one's style of living, the attempt to render a life worthy of endless repetition. Of course, there are many objections and emotional reactions to the idea. Some will find it metaphysically implausible and insist on empirical cosmology as the check. Others will note that even if literal recurrence is impossible, the thought experiment retains force as a reflective tool. The thought's persistence owes to its capacity to foreground what we normally procrastinate about. Whether the universe loops or not, imagining the loop asks you to evaluate your life under the sternest of standards. Would you take this life back, unedited and whole? Consider, too, the contrast with nihilism. At first glance, the thought seems to push toward nihilism. If everything repeats, why care? Nietzsche wanted to rescue us from that very slide. He claimed that the true test is whether you can transform the recurrence into a yes, not whether you can wring meaning from cosmic futility. The heroic affirmation is not blind optimism, but a hard-won stance. The person who can embrace their fate has worked inwardly to make even suffering an object of acceptance, perhaps even of transmutation into strength and depth. Suffering is not eliminated. It is internalized and woven into a tapestry one can admire enough to face forever. The doctrine also reframes art and creativity. If your life is to be sculpted into a pattern that will recur, then aesthetic considerations become ethical ones. How do you compose a life with musicality, balance, dissonance, and resolution? Nietzsche's ideal is not moralizing austerity, but the creation of a form of life that one could inhabit again and again, that resists boredom and gains texture under repetition. This aestheticized ethic invites experimentation, daring, and a kind of intellectual honesty about one's loves and hates. Finally, the eternal recurrence provokes a sober humility toward hope and control. If your fate is to be affirmed, it does not mean passivity. Affirmation requires work, the cultivation of responses, the discipline to accept what cannot be changed, and the audacity to change what you can. The doctrine asks you to act not out of resentment, nor out of the illusion of an ultimate future salvation, but out of a refined, present-minded responsibility. Live now so that the echo you would hear forever is one you can embrace. When you sit with the image of the loop, the initial sensation may be vertigo or intense clarity. Either reaction is useful, either reaction is an invitation. The test of Nietzsche's greatest philosophical riddle is not its cosmic truth, but its existential efficacy. If the thought makes you flinch from your past, perhaps it reveals leftover compromises demanding repair. If it frees you to accept what you cannot change and to shape what you can, then it has done the work of a great moral invention. It has taught you to live as if each instant mattered beyond measure. The butterfly dream. One night you dream you are a butterfly, sunlight on gauzy wings, drifting without a thought for who you were before the flower. You flutter through a garden that smells of some memory you cannot name, and for the length of the dream, you are utterly the butterfly. Appetite, motion, the small, immediate joy of being airborne. Then you awake and find yourself lying in a room with your own hands folded across your chest, bewildered for a breath. The old story of Zhuangzi makes this wobble between forms into philosophy. Did Zhuangzi dream he was a butterfly, or was the butterfly dreaming Zhuangzi? And if the dream was as vivid as waking, on what grounds do we insist one state is truer than the other? The scene is deceptively simple because it forces you to look at the scaffolding of certainty. We tend to live as if waking experience is trustworthy, while dreams are unreliable noise. Dreams are dismissed as illusions because they misrepresent the world. They put a man in a room when there is no room, or they let you fly when you cannot. But Zhuangzi presses you to notice that the felt reality of a dream is not qualitatively different from the felt reality of waking. In both cases, there is a stream of images, sensations, emotions, and attached narratives. The only difference is one of origin. Wakeful perceptions are caused by bodies interacting with an environment we call external, dreams by internal processes. And that difference, Zhuangzi hints, may not be philosophically decisive. This is not merely metaphysical quibbling, but a hinge on identity and transformation. When you dream you are a butterfly, what is the locus of self? Is there a metaphysical you that persists across states, a subject that remains constant whether in a body or a winged guise? Or is selfhood itself a pattern that arises and dissolves with circumstances, like a melody that can be played by different instruments? Taoist threads lean to the latter. The boundary we call I is porous, a temporary eddy in the larger current of becoming. To Zhuangzi, the dream undermines the arrogance of fixed identity. It nudges us towards seeing life as change and not as an artifact to be possessed. You were butterfly, you were man, and neither state exhausts the larger process that contains them both. The thought opens a view of knowledge that is gently skeptical but not paralyzing. If dream and waking can feel equally real, we must be cautious about claims of privileged access. Yet skepticism need not lead to despair. Zhuangzi's point is often therapeutic. The world's mutability frees you from the tyranny of rigid judgments. If the boundary between dream and life is not absolute, then suffering that arises from attachment, to status, to identity, to outcomes, can be loosened. The butterfly dream thus functions as an existential lesson. Instead of clutching the true state, practice changing with the wind. The Tao is less a metaphysical doctrine about what exists, and more a pedagogy about how to live amid flux. Philosophically, you can read the dream two ways. One is metaphysical and asks which description maps the world better. Are dreams merely internal hallucinations overlaying a stable external reality? Or is waking experience itself a kind of communal dream stitched together by shared consent and bodily regularities? The second is ethical and practical. How should the possibility that waking might be dreamlike affect how you act? Zhuangzi tends to favor the latter reading. He is less interested in proving which ontological story is correct than in showing that recognizing the dreamlike quality of life changes our relationship to it, softening fear, enhancing wonder, and loosening the need to dominate. Modern analogies make the tale feel immediate. Technology gives us virtual realities that can be immersive. Neuroscience shows how the brain manufactures both dreaming and waking contents from patterns of activity. And psychology reveals how delusions and hallucinations can feel as real as consensual perception. These discoveries do not collapse the distinction between dream and life, they reframe it. Whether you are a butterfly in sleep or a human in daylight, lived reality is constructed, fragile, and contingent. Zhuangzi's irony is to turn this fragility into grace. Once you see the construction, you can inhabit it with humility instead of blind certainty. There's a moral tenderness in the dream, too. If the line separating waking from dreaming is thin, then the empathy we extend should not be limited to an arbitrarily privileged state. When you comfort another person, you respond to their felt world, regardless of its ontological status. A lover's grief in the night is no less real to them because it arises in sleep. A mind's conviction, however mistaken in theory, is subjectively powerful and morally salient. The dream story thus widens ethical concern. The reality that deserves compassion is the lived experience, however produced. But Zhuangzi does something else that is easy to miss. He turns the puzzle into a call for freedom. If you can be butterfly and then wake up man without contradiction, then identities are negotiable. You can experiment with being less rigid, try on different roles, and let yourself be surprised. The Taoist sage is not one who claims a metaphysical high ground. She is someone who navigates transformations with an ease that looks almost childlike. The sage, like the butterfly, does not clutch at permanence. Instead, she rides change, responds to the immediate, and finds harmony without demanding ownership. There is also a religious and mystical edge. Some read the dream as pointing to a deeper unity. Self and world are not two separate substances, but modes of one process. The boundary dissolves, and what remains is a single unfolding reality, in which distinctions are pragmatic conveniences rather than absolute divides. In that register, the butterfly dream is a parable of awakening. Enlightenment is not about gaining a new thing, but about seeing that the distinction you relied upon was provisional. That insight can be liberating or unsettling. It depends on whether you equate loss of fixed identity with annihilation or with release. Practical consequences ripple outward. If life may be a dream, then urgency and significance do not vanish. They are recontextualized. You might find that small acts matter more precisely because the scene is ephemeral. Kindness, curiosity, and courage become valuable because they shape the fleeting pattern you presently inhabit. Or you might find that apparent tragedies lose their sting because they are transient appearances on a broader stage. Either way, the dream invites a different posture toward impermanence. Not despair, but a deliberate lightness. When you return from the parable, there is no neat solution to the question of whether you are dreaming life or whether life is the dream. That very lack of closure is the point. Zhuangzi's butterfly stays with you not because it solves metaphysical puzzles, but because it trains a sensibility. Hold your certainty softly, honor experience where it happens, and let the line between dream and waking be a place for wonder rather than a wall to defend. You can wake and feel the room around you, or you can sink back and remember what it felt like to be a butterfly. Either way, the lesson is the same. The self is a story told in shifting voices, and recognizing the storytelling is the first step toward living lightly within it. The teletransportation paradox. You step into a gleaming pod, the kind of machine that lives in science fiction and the anxious corners of our minds. Lights track across a polished surface, sensors hum, and a calm voice tells you to relax. In an instant, or a carefully measured series of instants, your body is scanned down to the smallest detail, the pattern of your atoms recorded as data. That data is sent, perhaps to another chamber on the same ship, perhaps to a distant planet, where an assembler arranges new matter into the same pattern and switches it on. You open your eyes in a different place with the same memories, the same scar on your knee, the same private joke about your childhood dog. You are you, it seems, and yet the old you, the body that just vanished in a puff of technology, might still be lying where you stood, or might have been destroyed. The teletransportation paradox presses on that ache. If you are copied atom by atom, are you still you? At the heart of the paradox is a tension between two deep intuitions about identity. One intuition clings to the material substrate. Identity is a matter of continued possession of the same atoms, the same biological constituents arranged in an unbroken stream. On this view, the person who emerges at the destination is only a perfect replica, a clever forgery with all your memories but not you, because the chain of physical existence has been severed. The other intuition privileges pattern and psychological continuity. What makes you you is not the exact dust of your body, but the organization of your memories, values, and personality. If that pattern is preserved, whether by gradual repair or by perfect copying, the result is you in any relevant sense for morality, responsibility, and love. Philosophers have wrestled with versions of this problem for centuries, though it acquired modern sharpness with imagined teleporters and thought experiments. John Locke suggested that personal identity tracks consciousness. Continuity of memory and personal awareness ties past and present selves. Derek Parfit later nudged us away from a hard metaphysical cling to a single, indubitable self, and argued that what matters are psychological connections and continuity, the graded relations of memory, character, and intention. For Parfit, identity is not a single binary fact like a light switch. It admits degrees of importance. He made startling cases where the metaphysical question, whether the future being is numerically identical with the past being, becomes less important than whether the relations that matter for survival and responsibility hold. Teleportation pressurizes these views. If the machine destroys your original body in the process of copying and the destination being has your memories intact, your friends will treat that being as you. Your bank recognizes the signature, your partner recognizes the way you laugh, your projects go on. From a social and legal standpoint, continuity is preserved, but subjectively, many recoil. The intuition that there is a single, unbroken I that experiences the flow of time seems incompatible with the idea that destruction plus reproduction could deliver that same experiencer. The gnawing question is, who is the subject who finds themselves in the destination pod? Is there an unbroken psychological thread? An inner stream of consciousness that simply slides from one substrate to another? Or does the original stream halt and a new stream begin that merely inherits the old stream's content? The paradox becomes more vivid when we imagine variance. Suppose the teleporter does not destroy the original but makes a copy and sends it away, leaving the original intact. Now, there are two beings with equal claim to being you, each with the same memories stretching back to before the split. Which one is the real you? Both? Neither? The question exposes the inadequacy of a single, absolute notion of personal identity. If identity is strictly one of a kind, the duplication scenario appears impossible. Duplication creates a fork that cannot be reconciled with the idea of one continuing person. If instead, identity is a matter of degree or of psychological connectedness, we can accept that two continuations diverge from a shared past, each legitimately connected to it in ways that matter morally and prudentially, even as numerical identity fractures. This thread also ties back to a quieter but deeply relevant intuition: gradual replacement. Our bodies replace themselves over years. Cells die and are renewed. Molecules flow in and out. If the teleporter's reassembly were performed step by step, replacing atoms slowly until no original atom remained, would that be more or less permissible than an instantaneous scan and rebuild? Many feel a stronger claim to continuity in the gradual case. The replacement preserves causal chains and leaves intact an overlapping series of stages that link past to future. But if you accept gradual replacement as preserving identity, you commit to a kind of arbitrariness. Where is the cutoff? Replace the last atom, and the ship of yourself becomes a different object? That arbitrariness is exactly the philosophical pressure Parfit welcomed. Perhaps personal identity is not a metaphysical all or nothing, but a matter of relations that underpin our practical concerns. There are technical objections, too. Quantum mechanics suggests a principle called the no-cloning theorem, which forbids making perfect copies of arbitrary quantum states. If consciousness depends on quantum states in a way that matters for identity, perfect teletransportation might be physically impossible. Yet if consciousness supervenes only on classical patterns, on the informational layout of neurons, then copying might be physically feasible in principle, even if horrendously difficult in practice. This is an empirical question that blends metaphysics with neuroscience and physics, and it shows that the teletransportation problem is not purely armchair speculation. It touches on matters that experimental science may one day illuminate. Ethics and emotions swell up around the paradox. If a teleporter destroys the original, is that murder? If a society relies on duplication without destruction, do people lose their sense of mortality? Would people treat copies as disposable because the original persists somewhere? Would the knowledge that one could be perfectly replicated undermine uniqueness, dignity, or meaning? Conversely, if the important relations are psychological, perhaps teleportation offers a way to preserve what matters. Relationships, projects, and personal growth can continue across reassemblies, and fear of not being you can be soothed by the practical continuity of desires and responsibilities. The paradox also reframes the meaning of death. Death can be seen not only as the cessation of biological processes, but as the end of a particular pattern of psychological continuity. If a machine reproduces your pattern elsewhere, does death cease to be final? For some minds, that little consolation will ring hollow. The felt cessation of the stream of consciousness is a violence not remedied by a copy. For others, the persistence of their pattern in a new location, recognized by friends, institutions, and the self's projects, will count as survival enough. When you imagine stepping into that pod, the air tasting faintly of ozone and possibility, you are facing a choice between two philosophies of selfhood. One demands an unbroken river of subjectivity that cannot be bulldozed and rebuilt without loss. The other treats the self as an arrangement, a pattern of relations susceptible to replication, repair, and transfer. Both stances have consequences for how we think about responsibility, punishment, love, engineering, and mortality. Perhaps the deepest lesson is humility. The teletransportation paradox reveals how much of our identity is stitched together from metaphysical assumptions, social practices, and biological facts. It asks us whether we value the persistence of a single metaphysical subject above all else, or whether we are willing to ground our ethics and attachments in the continuities that truly affect lives, memory, character, commitments, and the capacity to continue projects. The answer you prefer will shape how you feel about stepping into that pod, whether you would press the button, and whether you would call the being who opens their eyes on the other side by your name. In the end, the paradox does not merely test metaphysical theories. It asks, gently and insistently, what matters to you when you say I. The Ship of Theseus. Imagine standing on the deck of an old wooden ship as gulls wheel overhead and the salt wind pulls at the rigging. The timbers creak under your feet, each plank worn by years of weather and voyage. Now imagine that over the course of a long life, the crew gradually replaces each plank as it rots. A new plank here, another there, until one day the whole hull mast and rails are different wood from the day she was launched. The Ship of Theseus asks a deceptively small question. After every part has been swapped out, is the vessel before you the same ship that first slipped its moorings? Or is it a new ship wearing the old name like a familiar coat? The puzzle tastes simple because same seems obvious in ordinary language. We speak of continuity, of preserving identity through repairs and restorations without batting an eye. But the philosophical worm hides in that casualness. The issue turns on what we mean by numerical identity. The deep claim that two things are not merely similar, but one and the same entity, as opposed to qualitative identity, the looser sense that two things share properties. When every part of a thing has changed, the two senses pull in different directions. The new hull is qualitatively identical in shape and function, yet its matter differs. Which dimension counts for sameness? Some thinkers start by attending to matter. If identity depends on being composed of the same material parts, then replacing a single plank breaks identity. Replace them all, and you no longer have the same ship. This mereological view ties identity to the particular atoms and molecules that compose an object. It is strict and, to some, uncomfortably brittle. Your body would not be you if even a single cell were replaced. But that strictness has appeal in its clarity. Identity is a fact about composition and nothing else. Others resist this atomic fix. They remind us that ordinary objects persist through flux without tragedy. A cathedral rebuilt stone by stone after fire is still called the same cathedral. People, too, are constant through ceaseless molecular turnover. Most cells in our bodies die and regenerate across years. Yet we sensibly say, the person endures. This view privileges continuity of form, function, and causal history. The ship that sails on under the same name, performing the same voyages, and holding the same social and legal relationships, seems the very same ship, even when its parts are replaced. Identity is not about the dirt under the varnish, but about the structured pattern that persists. Philosophers sharpen these intuitions into formal positions. Endurantists claim objects are wholly present at each moment they exist. They survive change without splitting into temporal parts. Perdurantists, by contrast, say objects are four-dimensional, extended in time as well as space, and are better understood as a series of temporal stages or time slices. On perdurantism, the ship that sailed in year 1 is not numerically identical to the ship in year 20. They are slices of a longer four-dimensional entity. The language of stages dissolves the bite of the paradox. Sameness becomes a matter of relations between temporal parts, rather than stubborn sameness across all times. Then a new wrinkle arrives. What if the old planks, once removed, are collected and reassembled into a second vessel identical in every way to the repaired ship? Suddenly there are two candidates for the original Theseus. Which one is the real ship? Does the one that retained continuous use in history hold priority, or the one made from the original matter? This replica problem pushes either criterion to extremes and makes paradoxical consequences real. If identity is transitive and univocal, we cannot have both reconstruction and continuity simultaneously be the same original ship without breaking logic. The options become uncomfortably stark. Accept that original can have two conflicting senses. Accept that identity is vague in such borderline cases. Or accept that our ordinary talk about the ship conceals a more complex ontological reality. Some philosophers embrace vagueness. They treat identity as having borderline cases like heap in the Sorite's paradox. There is no precise boundary where replacement ceases to yield the same ship. Instead, there is a gray zone where ordinary language falters. That has the comforting feature of matching our intuitions about many everyday transitions, but it also offloads the problem into an epistemic fog that can feel unsatisfying for those who crave strict philosophical accounts. Another fruitful path is to differentiate between being the same object and being constituted by the same material. The constitution view says a thing can be constituted by matter without being identical to that matter in a metaphysical sense. The old planks may constitute the identity of the ship in one respect, while the ongoing form and function constitutes the identity in another. This allows us to say the ship both persists and is not strictly identical to the original atoms that once crowded its keel. It tolerates different overlapping ways of talking about the same without collapsing into contradiction. The Ship of Theseus has an uncanny habit of turning into stories about people. Consider a human mind. Neurons fire, synapses strengthen and decay, proteins turnover. Over years, the biological substrate changes vastly. If identity required the same particles, none of us would last more than a breath. John Locke proposed that personal identity rests on memory and psychological continuity. You are the same person as long as you can remember being that person. Derek Parfit later complicated this, showing how personal identity might be less about a single immutable self, and more about psychological connectedness and continuity as matters of degrees. Parfit's thought experiments about fission and teleportation demonstrate that identity can be metaphysically perplexing without undermining moral or prudential concerns. what matters can be psychological continuity, even if strict numerical identity is ambiguous. Modern technology sharpens the puzzle into immediate ethical terrain. If prosthetics, organ transplants, brain-machine interfaces, or whole brain emulation become routine, what anchors personal identity? Suppose a teleportation device perfectly scans your brain, destroys the original, and reconstructs you atom by atom elsewhere. Is the reconstructed being you, or a perfect copy with the same memories listening in a brave new body? If a machine duplicates your pattern without transferring the same atoms, is continuity preserved? The Ship of Theseus pushes us to ask whether identity is a metaphysical fact or a practical stance we adopt to make sense of responsibility, love, and legal claims. Law and society answer differently than metaphysics sometimes. Legal systems locate identity in continuity of records, title, and social recognition. The ship that keeps sailing under the same registration is the ship whose insurance the captain can call upon. Families preserve identity through narratives. The heirloom is cherished not because of molecules, but because of stories attached to it. In human affairs, identity is often a social achievement, as much as a metaphysical property. This pragmatic perspective is not philosophical evasion. It recognizes that many disputes about sameness are resolved not by peering under microscopes, but by appealing to practices that make life possible. If you step back from technicalities, the Ship of Theseus teaches a softer lesson about what it is to be. Identity, whether for ships, stones, or selves, is a knot of relationships. Causal history, material composition, continuity of form, function, narrative, and social ties. Different contexts privilege different strands of the knot. Science tends to emphasize composition and causal chains. Everyday life privileges continuity and role. Ethics clings to psychological continuity because moral responsibility attaches to memories and intentions. The paradox invites you to notice these strands and see how they pull. So when you imagine walking that old deck once more, the timbers underfoot may be different wood, but the pattern of sails catching the same wind, the creak of the rigging, the shared stories of voyages and storms all bind together into something we are willing to call continuous. Whether metaphysics demands a single unequivocal answer, whether one plank replaced too many dissolves the identity, remains an open question. Perhaps sameness is less a strict metaphysical possession and more a story we tell to hold experience together. In that story, the ship persists, not because it clings to its original atoms, but because people remember it, care for it, sail it, and call it by a name that knots past and present into a living thread. Schrödinger's cat. You close your eyes and imagine a plain wooden box, a sleepy cat curling inside, and a mechanism so small and strange that it unmakes our ordinary confidence in what is. A single unstable atom sits waiting. If it decays, a detector trips a hammer, a vial shatters, poison is released, and the cat dies. If the atom does not decay, the cat sleeps through the hour and wakes. Quantum mechanics says that, until someone opens the box and looks, the atom does not have a definite state of decayed or not decayed, but sits in a superposition of both possibilities. Schrödinger put the cat into this setup not to torture a pet, but to dramatize a puzzle. If microscopic things can be in superposed states, why do macroscopic things, cats, tables, people, always seem to pick one reality or the other? Can a cat be both alive and dead at once? And if not, where does the ambiguity stop? To feel the strangeness, step back and listen to how quantum theory speaks. At the microscopic level, the world is described by a wave function, a mathematical object that encodes multiple possible outcomes at once, each with its own amplitude. These amplitudes interfere, add and subtract, producing patterns no classical probability could. When we measure a system, we do not observe these amplitudes directly. Instead, we observe a single outcome. The rule that connects the two, the Born rule, tells us the chance of seeing each outcome. But that rule leaves open a deeper question. What happens between the initial superposition and the single result? Does the world literally contain both possibilities until measurement collapses them into one? Or does the act of measurement carve reality into separate branches? Or is the wave function simply a tool for expressing our knowledge? One answer is the traditional Copenhagen view. The superposition is not a statement about the cat being partly alive and partly dead in any ordinary sense, but about the probabilities of different outcomes. Opening the box forces the system to choose, and the wave function collapses. Before you open it, it is improper to speak of the cat as definitely alive or definitely dead. The theory refuses to assign classical certainties until measurement occurs. To many, this answer feels humble and practical, but it also smells like magic. Where does collapse happen? And why should an act of observation, or observation by a conscious mind according to some readings, trigger a physical transition? Another move is the many worlds interpretation. Here, the mathematics is taken at face value. The wave function never collapses. Instead, every possible outcome is realized in a branching multiverse. When you lift the lid, the universe splits into branches. In one, you see a living cat, in another, a dead one. And both are equally real, though forever non-interacting. The cat is not schizophrenically alive and dead in your branch. It is alive in one branch and dead in another. This removes the need for a mysterious collapse mechanism, but it replaces one strangeness with another, a vast proliferation of unobservable worlds, and forces us to reconsider the meaning of probability if all outcomes happen. Modern physics offers a crucially important piece that softens the most dramatic intuitions: decoherence. Any macroscopic object like a cat is constantly interacting with its environment: photons, air molecules, thermal vibrations. These interactions entangle the system with countless degrees of freedom so quickly that the coherent superpositions required to see interference between alive and dead are effectively destroyed in negligible time. Decoherence does not enact a physical collapse. It explains why coherent superpositions are practically unobservable at large scales, and why classical, definite outcomes emerge so reliably. Think of it as a blurring of phases. The different branches of the wave function lose a fixed relationship to each other and behave as separate classical alternatives. In practice, this is why you never catch a cat half alive on the windowsill. The environment insists on one story, and the others fade into records you cannot retrieve. But decoherence alone does not answer whether the wave function describes reality itself, or just our information about it. Is the superposed state an ontic condition, a real ambiguity in the world, or an epistemic reflection of our ignorance? Some philosophers and physicists favor objective collapse theories, proposals that add a new physical law causing superpositions to spontaneously localize when systems reach a certain scale or mass. These aim to place a real boundary between quantum and classical, making the transition a physical process rather than a mere appearance. Others hold the wave function as the primary reality and reconstrue our experience of singular outcomes as branches or emergent patterns. The paradox also spawns delightful variations that pry at identity and observation. Wigner's friend imagines a friend inside the box making a measurement and thus seeing a definite outcome, while an outside observer still treats the friend plus system as a superposition. This thought experiment teases apart objectivity and subjectivity in quantum mechanics. Can two observers validly assign different states to the same physical situation? The answers bleed into debates about relational quantum mechanics and the role of information. Perhaps facts are relative to observers, or perhaps there is an ultimate description we have yet to grasp. Experimentation has pushed the metaphorical cat into laboratory reality in surprising ways. Physicists have engineered cat states in superconducting circuits and in photonic systems, fragile superpositions of macroscopically distinct states that behave like miniature Schrödinger cats. Interference fringes have been observed with progressively larger molecules. Trapped ions and quantum bits have been coaxed into being in two states at once. These results do not show an actual feline flickering between life and death, but they do show that the bizarre principles of quantum superposition can scale up farther than early physicists believed. The real cat remains safe because the timescales and environmental coupling at biological scales make coherent superpositions essentially impossible to sustain. Philosophically, the thought experiment forces us to wrestle with what counts as real. Is reality the totality of the wave function, with branches we cannot rejoin? Is it the set of events recorded by observers? Is it a set of stable patterns emergent from messy interaction with an environment? The cat tests our intuitions about objectivity, identity, and the nature of probability. It asks whether the indeterminacy of quantum mechanics is metaphysical, the world literally lacking a single determined outcome, or epistemic, our best description until the world chooses one. There is also an ethical tenderness in the image. Schrödinger's vivid device pressures us to recognize the distance between elegant formalism and living systems. The mathematical trick exposes conceptual seams precisely because we care about cats. The thought experiment succeeds not by proving the world to be paradoxical, but by making the paradox feel human-sized. It shows that physics is not a disinterested game played with symbols. It grapples with the same questions about existence and certainty that keep us lying awake at night. In the end, the cat is less a riddle with one right answer than a lamp you turn on in a dark attic. It reveals the architecture of modern physics: superposition and interference at the bottom, decoherence knitting together the apparent solidity of the everyday, and a plurality of interpretations vying to tell the story of how the world arranges itself. When you imagine opening the box, what you practice is curiosity. The small ceremonial act of checking whether nature conforms to your expectations, or whether it surprises you, whether the cat was ever truly both alive and dead, or whether that phrase merely points to a deeper ambiguity in how the quantum and the classical meet the image, leaves you with a sharper eye for how strange and how beautiful the world is, and with a gentle invitation to hold wonder and hesitation together as equally sensible responses to the unknown.